It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up to the mountains near Salmon, Idaho. I was 31 years old, working remotely at the time, and had been feeling overwhelmed with screen time and city noise. I needed to get away for a few days and breathe actual fresh air. I'd always enjoyed the outdoors, nothing extreme, just the kind of camping where you drive as far up the dirt roads as your truck will go, pitch a tent near a creek or a small meadow, and try to remember what the sky looks like without light pollution. I picked a place I'd marked on an old paper map a couple years back. It was deep in the Bitterroot Range, about 40 miles from the nearest town, and maybe 10 from the last house or cabin. I remembered the Forest Service roads getting a little rough past a certain point, but I had a decent 4x4 and I packed everything I thought I'd need. I brought food for 5 days, extra water, a satellite beacon just in case, a weather-rated tent, and all the basics: fire starter, knives, GPS, compass, even a flare gun I'd never used. I also brought a 9mm pistol. I wasn't planning to use it, but I wasn't going out there totally unarmed either. The drive up took most of the day. I left around 7 in the morning and didn't get to the site until a little past 5. The roads got worse just like I remembered, long stretches of washboard gravel, then narrowing to dirt with loose rock. I had to go real slow the last couple miles, letting the truck crawl up the slope while watching for ruts or sudden drops. But eventually, I found the clearing I'd remembered. It was a flat area just off a bend in the forest road, surrounded by pines on 3 sides and opening to a small, quiet stream that ran down a slope toward a thicker patch of trees. It looked undisturbed. No trash, no tire tracks, not even any boot prints. I liked that. I parked the truck and took a few minutes to walk the perimeter of the site. Felt calm and still. The only noise was the trickle of the stream and the light wind pushing through the upper branches. I didn't see any big game tracks, no bear scat, no elk or deer prints either. Just a few squirrel holes and the occasional rabbit trail. I set up camp near the truck. I pitched my tent with the door facing the stream and built a small fire ring a few feet away using stones I found around the area. I collected some dry wood, mostly fallen limbs and bark, and had a fire going before dusk. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire for a few hours, had a couple cans of soup, and leaned back in a camp chair listening to the woods. There were crickets, the occasional owl, and once or twice I thought I heard something bigger moving through the brush far off, but it didn't feel threatening. I chalked it up to deer or maybe a porcupine. I went to bed around 11, leaving my pistol inside the tent near my sleeping bag, just in case. The next morning was cold. I stepped out of the tent and could see my breath, the grass around me wet with frost. I made instant coffee, warmed up a breakfast packet, and spent the morning hiking a few miles out from camp. I brought a small pack with water, jerky, and my GPS, and tried to make mental notes of the trail. Most of it was thick pine and spruce, with narrow clearings and uneven ground that dipped toward the stream. I saw a lot of fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and more signs of small game. Still no bears or large predators. But I did see something strange around noon. I was about 2 miles southeast of my camp, walking along a ridge where the trees opened up a little, when I spotted what looked like an old wooden structure below the ridge line. I couldn't see much, just the outline of what might have been a roof or a collapsed wall. It was covered in leaves and brush, almost hidden by the way the land dipped down there. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, so I made my way down to check it out. It was an old trapper's shelter, or maybe a hunting blind, though it looked abandoned for decades. The wood was gray and splintered, nails rusted out, roof half caved in. It didn't look like anyone had been near it in years, but there was something off about it. Inside, the floor was dirt with a patch of flattened grass, like someone or something had recently laid there. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't packed with leaves or dust either. It looked used, just not often. I didn't stick around long. I felt something in my gut tighten. I wasn't scared exactly, but my brain told me I'd seen enough. I made my way back to camp the same way I came, marking the ridge on my GPS so I wouldn't go near it again. The rest of that day passed slow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I barely slept. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe a branch falling, but then I heard what sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps. slow and spaced out. Not heavy like a bear, and not light like a deer. Something walking on two legs. I sat up in my sleeping bag, completely still. My hand reached for the pistol, and I held it against my chest while I listened. The sound moved around the tent. Not fast, just pacing. It circled once, maybe twice, then stopped near the fire ring. I could hear faint crunching of gravel and dry grass. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. Then, slowly, the sound faded away into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat up with the gun in my lap, heart racing, staring at the shadow of the tent wall. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside and looked around. There were prints in the frost near the fire pit. Boot prints, adult-sized, not mine. That shook me. I spent the day deciding whether to pack up and leave or stay one more night. A part of me thought maybe it was a lost hiker or a hunter who didn't realize I was camping there. But the prints had come right up to my tent and stayed a while. I couldn't think of any good reason for that. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to camp, made the fire bigger, and kept my pistol on me at all times. I checked the truck to make sure nothing had been tampered with. Everything was as I left it. I didn't see or hear anything else unusual until that night. At around 10, I was still up, sitting by the fire with a headlamp on. I was trying to read a map, thinking maybe I'd find a faster way back down the mountain. That's when I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A camera shutter, very faint like from a phone, came from the trees to my left, just out of view. I turned the headlamp toward the sound and saw nothing. I stood up, holding the flashlight and my gun, and walked toward the edge of the camp, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone. No more sounds, no footsteps, no movement, just trees and shadows. I stood there for several minutes, listening. Then I slowly backed toward the fire, doused it with water, and went straight into the tent. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I was done. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I left no trash, buried the fire pit, rolled up the tent, and loaded the truck in under an hour. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, didn't even use the bathroom. I just wanted to get out. The drive down the mountain was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror and watching the tree line, half expecting someone to step out into the road. But no one did. I reached the main gravel road by late morning and cell service by afternoon. When I got home, I checked the photos on my phone just to be sure nothing weird had shown up. Everything was normal. I called the Forest Service a few days later and asked if anyone had reported strange activity in that part of the range. They said no. But the part that still keeps me up at night, the part one can't forget, came a week later. I was going through my camping gear to clean it, and I found something I didn't pack. It was a small, folded piece of paper tucked under my sleeping bag. No writing on it, just a single photo printed on the front. It was me, sleeping in my tent. The photo was taken from outside, looking through the mesh door. My face was partly visible in the sleeping bag. It had been taken sometime during that second night. That was it for me. I haven't camped alone since. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to campgrounds now with people around, lights, and cell service. I don't know who was out there with me or why they were watching, but I know they came close. Close enough to leave a picture, and that's as real as it gets. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the backwoods of northern Idaho. It was July 2017, and I had just wrapped up a heavy few months of freelance design work, staring at screens for 10 to 12 hours a day. I was burned out and needed to be away from everything. Phones, cars, people. I wanted to feel like I didn't exist for a while, like I was completely removed from the constant notifications and noise. I chose a place called Dead Horse Creek. It was a stretch of forest tucked between two ridges, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't hear or see anyone for days. I'd read about it in an old forum post where someone mentioned it was as quiet as you can get without stepping into Canada. That sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A tent, a sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a water filter, extra clothes, a hatchet, a small camp stove, a couple knives, a flashlight, and my GPS with extra batteries. I also brought a topo map and compass just in case the electronics failed. I made sure to tell my brother where I was going and when I'd be back. I planned to hike out, set up camp for 4 days and hike back. Nothing fancy, just isolation. The first day went smooth. I drove my truck as far as the dirt road would let me, then loaded my pack and headed in. The hike was beautiful, green pines, low ferns, and the kind of clean air that only exists miles from pavement. I passed along the creek bed for about 4 miles before settling on a spot about 30 yards from the water. It was flat and shaded, but open enough to not feel claustrophobic. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, filtered some water, and sat down on a log to eat dinner while the sun slipped behind the trees. That first night was uneventful, just the usual forest sounds. Crickets, wind, maybe a branch cracking under an animal's foot somewhere far off. I fell asleep easily, grateful for the escape. The second day, I explored. I walked upstream for about 2 miles and found a natural pool, deep and cold. I took a swim, careful not to slip on the rocks. The sun warmed me up fast afterward, and I dried off lying on a boulder. That night, I cooked rice and beans on the little stove and watched the stars come out. No problems, no stress. I felt like I'd made the right decision. It was the third night when things changed. I had gone to bed early, maybe around 9 p.m. The sky had been cloudy, and I was tired from a long hike I took earlier in the day that had me bushwhacking up one of the ridges. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees and woke up maybe 2 hours later to a different sound. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just the feeling that the normal forest sounds had stopped. No bugs, no rustling, nothing. Just the breeze, which had picked up a little. I opened my eyes and lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The silence was too complete, like everything had frozen. Then I heard a snap. It was close, too close. Not like a branch falling far away, but like someone stepping on a stick maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I held my breath and stayed still, trying to process. Could be a deer, I told myself. Maybe even a moose. But the steps weren't random or fast. They were slow. Deliberate. Step, crunch, pause, another step, then nothing. I sat up quietly, heart beating harder now. I pulled my flashlight from beside my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on yet. The walls of the tent were too thin to see through, so I just waited, trying to hear more. Couple minutes passed with nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. Pitch black, cloud cover blocked the moon, and the trees made everything darker. I still didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to give away my position if it was someone out there. I listened hard. Still nothing. Then a soft rustling, like something brushing against low branches, maybe 15 feet away. Then a grunt, quiet but not animal-like. It sounded human, like someone catching their breath while crouching or shifting their weight. I froze. My body wanted to panic, but I stayed low and crawled out of the tent, moving slow and quiet to the other side, putting the tent between me and the sound. I crouched there, waiting. More silence. Then, after maybe 5 minutes, a long, dragging sound like a stick or a foot being pulled through leaves and dirt. It moved laterally across the front of my tent. I didn't dare move. After a few more minutes, it was gone. I waited another 20, maybe 30 minutes before moving. I slowly circled back toward the creek and filled my Nalgene just for something to do. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think. Could it have been someone hunting? Possible, but unlikely this far in. Maybe a lost hiker? But the movements didn't sound confused. They sounded careful, too careful. Eventually I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept my knife in hand and the flashlight on my chest. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. By morning, the forest sounded normal again. Birds were chirping. The creek was bubbling. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the unease. I got up, packed my gear, and decided I'd move camp further upstream, somewhere with better visibility and fewer thick brush lines nearby. As I was packing, I noticed something I hadn't before. A boot print. It wasn't mine. Too large. Wide toe. Deep heel. It had been pressed into the soft dirt near a tree about 10 feet from my tent. The tread was different from my hiking boots. It looked older, like something from a work boot or logger boot, not a modern brand. And it was facing my camp, not away from it. That sealed it. I moved. I hiked about 2 miles upstream and found a spot on a gentle slope with a view down to the creek. It was rockier but safer, I thought. Harder to approach quietly. I set up again, this time more carefully. I cleared brush in a 15-foot radius, hung a few small noise traps using fishing line and tin lids, and kept my pack by my side instead of inside the tent. I figured if something happened again, I could grab and go. That evening, I skipped cooking. I ate granola bars and jerky and kept the fire small, more for morale than warmth. I stayed awake longer, watching the trees and listening. I didn't hear anything unusual, and by midnight I crawled into the tent and tried to rest. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. There was no sound this time, just a feeling, that same oppressive silence as the night before. I sat up, knife already in hand, and waited. Then I heard it. A soft crunch, but not on leaves. On rock, somewhere to my right, maybe 20 feet away. Then a slow, careful step. Another, then silence. My traps didn't make noise, which meant whoever or whatever it was came in from a different angle. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and flashlight, crawled out, and crept into the trees opposite the noise. I found a spot between 2 fallen logs and lay low, watching. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. After about 10 minutes, a faint shape moved through the darkness near my tent. I couldn't see it clearly, just that it was tall, definitely a person. They moved slowly around the tent, stopping once or twice to bend down, like they were inspecting something. Then, to my surprise, they moved away, not toward the creek, but back up the slope and into the woods. I waited another 15 minutes before moving. I went back to the tent, broke it down fast, stuffed everything into the pack and left. I didn't even care about leaving trash behind. I just needed to go. I hiked fast, headlamp off most of the time, using my compass to stay oriented. It was the longest night of my life. I didn't stop until daylight. By then, I was miles from the original site, exhausted and sore. I found a patch of ground near a rock outcropping and took a short nap while the sun rose. Then I kept hiking until I hit the dirt road and eventually made it back to the truck. I didn't look back once. I never reported it. What could I even say? That I heard something and saw a vague shape? That someone walked near my tent? There wasn't any crime, technically. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. That wasn't just some lost camper. They were watching me, moving slow, careful, patient. I haven't camped alone since then. I still go out sometimes, but only with others and never too deep. I stick to state parks and marked trails. I still think about it sometimes when I lie awake at night. I wonder who they were, what they wanted, if they were just curious or something worse. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that there are parts of the forest where the silence means something, where the usual rules don't apply, where someone might be watching, not ghosts or monsters, but people, real people with real intentions. And that's the scariest thing of all. I went camping alone in the summer of 2019, just outside a small town called Bellwood, in northern Michigan. I was 31 at the time, living in Grand Rapids, and working as a delivery driver. That job gave me a weird schedule. Some weeks I worked nonstop, others I barely had shifts. I had just come off a busy few weeks, and I wanted to get away from everything for a while. I liked being alone out in nature. No noise, no people, no schedule. I had done solo camping trips before, but never for more than 2 nights. This time I planned for 4 nights, 5 days. It felt like the right amount of time to reset without getting bored or stir-crazy. I picked a place called Harmon Lake. It wasn't a big lake, more like a quiet spot in the woods surrounded by thick trees and a few trails that weren't really maintained. There were no campgrounds, no rangers, no services, just open land and silence. I had found it on a forum where people talked about off-grid camping in Michigan. A few people mentioned it was hard to find, which sounded perfect to me. I wanted to get lost in the woods for a while, just me and my gear. I left early on a Tuesday morning. The drive took me a little over 4 hours. I had everything packed tight in the back of my car: tent, sleeping bag, cooler with dry ice, food, water, stove, bear spray, a good knife, a small hatchet, a basic first aid kit, and a few other essentials. My phone barely had a signal once I got off the main highway. I had a printed map just in case. I parked my car in a tiny pull-off spot about a mile from where the trailhead started. There weren't any signs, but I had screenshots and notes from that forum, and I followed those carefully. The hike into the woods took about 2 hours. The trail was narrow and rough, sometimes disappearing into the underbrush. I had to step over fallen trees and push through branches. My pack was heavy, and I was sweating pretty hard by the time I found a small flat clearing close to the lake. It wasn't visible from the trail, which I liked. There was no sign of anyone else around. No trash, no fire pits, nothing. It felt untouched. I set up my tent near a small slope that led down to the lake's edge. The water looked clean and calm. There were no docks, no boats, not even footprints in the dirt. It was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. Just the occasional bird or the soft sound of wind in the leaves. The first day passed peacefully. I set up camp, made a small fire, cooked some simple food, and walked around the area. I didn't go far, just explored the nearby woods and made sure I could find my way back. I took mental notes of odd trees and natural landmarks, just in case I needed to return without a trail. I turned in early that night. I was tired from the drive and the hike. The woods were cool and still. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day started the same. I boiled some water for coffee and oatmeal, sat by the lake, and watched the sun rise through the trees. The morning was cool and damp. I went for a longer hike around the lake's edge, climbing over rocks and moving through thick brush. I saw deer tracks, maybe raccoons. At one point, I thought I heard something big moving deeper in the woods, maybe a moose or a bear, but it stayed far away. I had bear spray, and I kept it on my belt at all times. By the third day, I had settled into a good rhythm. Eat, walk, relax, write in a small notebook I brought. I had no cell service, no internet, no distractions. It was exactly what I wanted. But that night, things started to feel off. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I'm not sure what woke me. I didn't hear anything specific, just a sudden alertness that hit me like cold water. My tent was dark, and everything was quiet. I lay still, listening. There was no wind, no insects, no frogs, nothing. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The woods are rarely silent at night. Even in calm weather, you'll hear something. That night, there was nothing at all, just complete stillness. Then I heard a soft thump outside. Not close, but not far either. It was dull, like something heavy dropping onto soft dirt. I held my breath and waited. Another thump, this one closer. Then another. Not footsteps exactly, but regular enough that it felt like movement. I slowly reached for my flashlight and turned it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. I waited. The sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else for a while, maybe 20 minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a tree branch falling. I turned off the flashlight and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of anyone or anything. But the silence from the night before stayed with me. That afternoon, I went farther up one of the trails I had avoided earlier. I wanted to see if there were other campsites or signs of people. I didn't find anything. No trash, no fires, no footprints. I even started to wonder if I imagined the sounds. That night, I went to sleep a little uneasy. I kept my bear spray right next to me. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time I heard something much closer, something moving around the tent. The sound was soft, like someone brushing lightly against the nylon walls. Then I heard a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My hand gripped the bear spray so tight my fingers started to go numb. The noise stopped after a while, and the woods were silent again. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I found something strange. About 15 feet from my tent, the dirt had been disturbed. A long, shallow groove had been carved into the ground, about 4 feet long and a foot wide. It looked like something had been dragged, just like I had heard. The soil was loose there, and leaves had been pushed aside. I looked around for prints, but I didn't find any clear ones, just some scuffs. I felt cold, even though the sun was shining. Something had been there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself it could have been an animal. Maybe a bear had dragged something, some prey, or maybe even my food bag if I had left it unsecured. I checked everything. My food was still hung properly between two trees. Nothing was missing. I stayed anyway. I didn't want to give in to fear, but I moved my tent a little closer to the lake's edge and kept a better fire going that night. That final night was the worst. I barely slept at all. I kept hearing faint movement in the woods, twigs snapping, brush rustling. Not constant, but enough to make me sit up and stare into the darkness. A few times I thought I saw something move between the trees. It was never close, and I never caught a clear look. Just motion low to the ground. Too big for a raccoon, too smooth for a deer. Once I thought I heard breathing, but that might have been my own. Just before dawn, I got out of the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed everything up fast, barely eating anything. I stuffed my gear into my pack, took down the tent in a rush, and didn't bother trying to clean anything up. I wanted to be gone. As I hoisted the pack onto my shoulders, I noticed something across the lake. On the opposite shore, maybe 100 yards away, something was standing near the tree line. I stopped. It wasn't moving, just standing. I couldn't see clearly because the light was still low, but it looked like a person. No color, no details, just a figure. I stared for a long time and it didn't move. I turned and walked away, fast and quiet, not looking back. The hike out felt longer than I remembered. I kept turning around, listening. I didn't hear or see anything, but the feeling didn't go away. I reached my car and got in without even taking the pack off. I drove straight back to Grand Rapids. I didn't stop for food or gas until I was well out of the woods. Back home, I washed everything and put my gear away. I told myself I had imagined a lot of it. Maybe I had. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe I let my mind wander too far. But I couldn't stop thinking about that dragging noise, that silent night, and that figure across the lake. A few weeks later, I went back to that forum and searched for more posts about Harmon Lake. I found a comment from someone who had been there the year before me. They said they had camped for 3 days but left early after hearing something circling their tent 2 nights in a row. They never saw anything, but they felt watched. Another person replied, saying they had hiked through that area and found an old hunting blind deep in the woods with fresh cigarette butts inside, even though no one should have been out there that season. I haven't been back since. I still go camping, but I stick to marked campgrounds now, places with other people nearby. I never camp alone anymore, no matter how much I want the quiet. Something was out there near Harmon Lake, and even if it wasn't anything supernatural or strange, it was real. I don't know if it was a person or an animal or something else, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know I won't ever go back. I went camping alone in the fall of 2017 when I was 31. I had taken time off from my job at the time, a data entry role in a small insurance firm, and decided I needed a break from people. I'd been feeling worn out, tired of the city noise, and I thought some quiet in the woods would help. I wasn't a total beginner. I'd gone on weekend hikes and a few overnight solo trips before, mostly near Lake Superior, but this time I planned to be out for 3 nights in the Manistee National Forest in Michigan. I picked a place that wasn't too remote, but not near any official campground either. I wanted to be away from the regular trails, somewhere I wouldn't see anyone else if I didn't want to. I had a topographic map, a good compass, and I preloaded the area on my GPS in case I got turned around. I packed food that didn't need refrigeration, rice, beans, jerky, oats, and had my water filter, a decent sleeping bag, and my 2-person tent. The weather looked fair, chilly but dry. The trees were in full autumn colors, mostly gold and deep red. I set out early in the morning on a Thursday and hiked about 4 miles into the woods from the nearest dirt road. It was hilly, with lots of old hardwoods and fallen logs scattered along the forest floor. A creek ran nearby, which made it a good spot for setting up camp. It wasn't a flat area, exactly, but I found a decent patch tucked behind a stand of hemlocks where I could pitch my tent on a soft layer of pine needles. That first day was peaceful. I set up camp, boiled some rice and beans, and sat there as the woods quieted. You can tell when the daytime birds quiet down and the nocturnal ones start. Everything feels slower, like the forest itself exhales. That night I heard coyotes far off, but nothing close. I slept all right, waking once or twice from the cold but managing to drift off again. The next day I hiked a bit further north with a light pack just to explore. I didn't see anyone. No tents, no wrappers, no signs of people at all. That was what I wanted, but still, there's a feeling that settles in when you realize you are the only person within miles. It's not fear exactly. It's more like heightened awareness. Every sound becomes a little more important. Every crunch of a leaf or crack of a branch feels like it's happening closer. When I got back to camp that afternoon, everything looked the same. Nothing moved. My gear was where I left it. I boiled some water, added it to instant oats, and ate slowly, listening to the wind move through the trees. It got dark around 6:45. I had a small fire going, not for warmth but for comfort. I sat there until it burned low, then put it out completely and climbed into my tent. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I couldn't say what time it was. I didn't have a watch and my phone was powered off to save battery. But it was dark, really dark. I heard something walking, not far off either. The steps were slow with weight to them, heavier than a deer, definitely not a raccoon or anything small. It moved a few steps, stopped, then moved again. I lay perfectly still, listening. I didn't breathe too loud. My ears strained against the silence. The steps circled slowly, then faded. I didn't move until the sky began to lighten. The moment it did, I got out of the tent and looked around. I didn't see any tracks, but the forest floor was thick with leaves and soft dirt. It'd be easy to miss any prints unless you were right on top of them. I told myself it was probably a black bear. They're not rare in that part of Michigan, and they sometimes roam at night. Still, something about the pacing steps didn't sit right with me. I couldn't explain why. Bears don't usually circle. They sniff and move on. The next day I considered hiking back, but I told myself I was just being jumpy. I come out here to be alone after all. I filtered water, hiked around near the creek, and tried to settle my nerves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just slightly off. That night, after eating jerky and some trail mix, I sat again by a small fire. I turned my phone on briefly to check for signal. None, and then turned it off. The sun dipped behind the hills, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest got quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. It was one of those heavy silences where you can almost hear your own heartbeat. I didn't fall asleep easily. My ears stayed open for any noise. And sure enough, maybe a couple hours after I lay down, I heard the steps again. This time they were closer, still slow, still deliberate. I lay still again. No flashlight, no movement, just listening. The steps got to the edge of the tent. They stopped. I felt the presence outside. I didn't hear breathing, but I could tell something. Someone stood there. I don't know how long it lasted. 30 seconds? A full minute? Felt longer. Then the steps moved again, slow and steady, into the trees. In the morning, I got out and scanned the area. I found something maybe 10 feet away, a broken branch near knee level. It wasn't a fresh break, but it looked like someone had stepped into a low bush and snapped it while turning. It might have been anything, but in that moment, I decided I was done. I packed up my gear, doused the fire pit with water until it turned to mud, and started hiking back to the road. Took a few hours, but I didn't stop. I pushed through without resting. When I reached the gravel pull-off where my car was parked, I felt the tension leave my body all at once. I sat in the car for a while before starting it. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just drove, letting the hum of the tires on pavement settle my nerves. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps at first. I didn't even write it down. It stayed in my mind, like a knot that wouldn't loosen. I kept thinking about the way it had circled, the weight in the steps, The way it stood there, silently, right outside the tent. If it was a person, what were they doing that far out in the woods at night, without a flashlight or fire? And if it wasn't a person, what else walks like that, deliberately and slow? A few weeks later, I came across a post on a hiking forum. Someone had camped near the same area earlier that fall. Their story was short, but they described hearing slow, heavy footsteps outside their tent at night. No other details, just that. It was enough to make my stomach drop. I didn't reply. I didn't want to feed the story or draw any attention. I haven't been camping alone since then. I still hike. I still like the woods, but I don't sleep out there alone anymore. Something about that silence, the waiting stillness, the way the footsteps moved, it changed something in me, made me realize that the wild isn't empty. Just because we don't see someone out there doesn't mean we're alone. That trip didn't end with anything dramatic. No confrontation, no violence, no horror movie twist. But I'm glad it didn't. Whatever that was out there, man or animal, I'm just thankful it didn't come back a third time. Sometimes the scariest moments are the quietest ones. The ones where nothing happens, but everything could've. That's the part one still think about. I've still got the gear. It's packed in a closet. Every once in a while, I think about trying again, going back out just for a night, just to prove I can. But then I remember the sound of those footsteps. Slow, heavy, careful, and I decide against it. Better to leave some distances unwalked. I was 33 when I took a week off from my job at the small car repair shop in Dayton, Oregon. The place never really changed. Same potholes on Main Street, same low gray clouds hanging over the town. That summer, work had been grinding me down more than usual. I'd been putting in long hours, especially with the sudden rush of people needing pre-vacation tune-ups. I felt like I hadn't had a quiet moment to myself in months. I figured I could use a break. Nothing fancy, just me, my truck, a tent, and the woods. I wanted space and silence. Something away from the noise of torque wrenches, ringing phones, and greasy lunch counters. I chose a place called Silver Pine State Reserve, about 2.5 hours southeast of town. I'd never been there before, but a guy I knew said it was less crowded than other spots, especially midweek. He was right. When I pulled into the park's gravel entrance road on a Tuesday afternoon, I didn't see a single other vehicle. The air was warm and dry, filled with the smells of dust and pine sap. There were no rangers, no entrance booth, just a rusted metal pay box and a stack of water-stained trail maps under a plexiglass lid. I tossed in my camping fee and took a map. The trail I picked, Marker Ridge Loop, ran deep into the reserve. A 5-mile hike to a primitive site near a small lake called Mirror Pond. The trailhead was at the far end of the parking lot. It started narrow and dusty, winding through shoulder-high brush and low pines. I could hear nothing but the crunch of my boots and the faint buzz of flies and bees moving through the branches. I carried everything I needed in a mid-size pack. Small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, flashlight, 2 knives, a bit of food, and some basic first aid. No cell service this deep, but that was fine by me. I had told no one where I was going. Not because I wanted to be mysterious. I just didn't think it mattered. The hike was easy at first. A gentle incline and soft earth. But about 3 miles in, the trail started climbing. The trees got denser and the temperature dropped. I noticed how quickly the sun disappeared behind the ridge to the west. I kept a good pace, and by 5 p.m., I reached the small clearing near the lake. The pond was smaller than I expected. Not much bigger than a swimming pool, really, but it was still and black, reflecting the trees like polished glass. There was a flat patch of ground near the water with signs of old campfires. Ashes, some rusted cantops, a half-melted shoe sole. I set up my tent there and gathered a few fallen branches to build a fire. I didn't light it yet, just arranged the wood in a pyramid and got my camp in order. That first night was peaceful. After eating a can of chili and a granola bar, I sat near the pond and watched the stars come out. The forest made its usual sounds, soft creaks, distant bird calls, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Once I zipped into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost immediately. I didn't wake up once until morning. The next day, I wandered around the ridge. No real trails, but I followed some deer paths up a slope and got a better view of the pond and surrounding valley. It was beautiful in a raw, quiet kind of way. I saw no one, heard no distant ATVs or campers. Nothing but wind and branches. I started to feel good again, like something inside me was unwinding after being too tightly wound for too long. That changed on the third day. I had just finished breakfast, some instant oatmeal and black coffee, and was repacking my food into a bare bag to hoist into a nearby tree. That's when I saw it. A single footprint near the edge of the water. Not mine. I'd been wearing hiking boots the entire time, and this one was different. The sole had a narrow, smooth heel, probably a trail runner or low-profile sneaker. Definitely not my boot. The print faced the lake, close to where I'd filled my water the night before. It wasn't deep, but the outline was clear. I stared at it longer than I should have. The realization crept in slowly. Someone had been here, and not during the day. I'd have seen or heard them. No, this looked recent. Maybe that morning. Maybe while I slept. I walked the camp perimeter slowly, checking the underbrush. No other prints, no crushed plants or broken twigs. Just that one mark in the soft mud by the pond's edge. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd missed it before. Maybe it was an old print. But my gut said otherwise. That night, I didn't build a fire. I ate cold jerky and stayed close to my tent, flashlight in hand. I slept with my knife under my sleeping bag and the flap half-zipped so I could see out. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything at first, just the wind moving through the trees. But then I caught the sound again. A soft splash, like a foot slipping into shallow water. I didn't move. My mouth went dry. I strained to listen. The pond was maybe 20 feet from my tent. Another splash, then silence. I didn't unzip the flap. I didn't want to see. I just waited, breathing slow and shallow, until the light started to change and the birds began calling again. When it was fully light, I stepped out and walked to the water's edge. I didn't see anything at first. Then, just off to the right of where I'd filled my bottle, I saw fresh marks. Not just one footprint this time, several. Close together, irregular, like someone had crouched or paced in place. The mud was disturbed in a half circle. And then, about 5 feet away, on a flat rock near the water, I saw a small pile of twigs, arranged neatly in an X. I didn't put it there. I stood still, heart pounding. My breath came in short bursts, and I felt the fine hair on my arms stand up. I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. Everything went into the bag, half folded or not. I didn't eat. I didn't refill my water. I just walked. I didn't go back the way I came. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wanted to get out fast, and I figured the fire road shown on the map might connect to another trailhead a few miles north. The problem was that the fire road wasn't maintained. It was mostly overgrown, and in places it disappeared completely under brush and fallen branches. But I pushed forward, checking the sun and trying to keep my bearings. I stopped once to drink the last of my water and check my map. That's when I heard something again. A soft crack of a branch maybe 30 or 40 feet behind me. I turned, knife in hand, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt it again. That pressure in the air, like I wasn't alone. I kept moving faster now. My breath started coming in hard pulls. I could feel sweat running down my back. The fire road dropped into a ravine and then curved back up a steep slope. Halfway up the incline, I turned around again. Just trees. But something was wrong. A small branch, thin, fresh, was hanging off a pine trunk about 10 feet off the ground, like it had been broken recently and wedged there. Not natural. It didn't belong. It hadn't been there when I passed the tree a minute before. I turned and climbed faster. It took hours to find the main trail again. By the time I saw the faded wooden marker that pointed toward the southern access lot, I was exhausted. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I didn't stop. I hiked another 2 miles without rest. And then, finally, I saw my truck, parked exactly where I'd left it, coated in dust, the windows reflecting the trees. I didn't check anything. I threw my pack in the back seat, climbed in, and drove. The paved road back to town never looked so good. I stopped at a gas station 20 miles out, filled up, and bought 2 bottles of water and a sandwich. I sat in the lot with the engine running and ate while watching the mirror. Nothing followed me. No one appeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Not for days. Back home, I washed everything. My tent, my clothes, even the knife. I put the gear in the garage and didn't touch it again for a long time. I never told anyone about what happened. Not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, just because I didn't want to explain how I couldn't explain it. There was no face, no voice, no weapon. Just signs, just silence, just the feeling of being watched, tracked, maybe even played with. That was the worst part. The small, deliberate details. The X of twigs. The broken branch. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't some lost hiker. Someone was out there. Someone careful. Someone who didn't want to be seen, only noticed just enough to make sure I knew they were close. I never went back to Silver Pine. I don't go camping alone anymore either. I still fix cars, still live in Dayton. Life went on. But sometimes I'll be closing up the shop at dusk, the air quiet, the sky turning orange behind the mountains, and I'll feel it again, that same quiet pressure in my chest, like someone is watching from the edge of the lot, never moving, just close enough to remind me that I never really saw them, but they saw me. They saw everything. I still remember the sound of gravel crunching under the tires when I pulled off the narrow 2-lane road and into the small dirt clearing that served as the unofficial trailhead. It was the last weekend of October 2019. The air in Central Oregon had that dry, dusty smell of dead leaves and cooling pine. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while, just 2 nights off-grid. No cell signal, no emails, just the quiet of the woods and a chance to test out some gear I'd been collecting over the summer. I was 34 at the time, living in Eugene, and working as a freelance web designer. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress, projects piling up, clients changing specs mid-job, deadlines getting tighter. My sleep had been bad, and I was drinking more coffee than I should. This trip was supposed to help clear my head. I'd picked a small, rarely used spot near Quartz Lake, about 30 miles from the nearest town. No official campsites, just a faint trail that led to the edge of the water where a flat patch of land opened up. I found it a year before when hiking with a friend and marked the coordinates on an old topographic map. I parked my car off to the side so it wouldn't be visible from the road, pulled on my backpack, and started the 3-mile hike in. The trail was narrow and uneven with roots and low branches, and the slope dropped off steeply in a few places. I took my time. The wind was light but steady, and the trees made that soft rustling noise that always makes you feel small. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I reached the clearing by the lake. It was exactly as I remembered it. A wide, flat space covered in pine needles, maybe 30 feet from the water's edge. Trees stood in a ring around it like guards, their tall trunks rising straight and narrow, branches high and sparse. The lake itself was quiet. No boats, no cabins, just the sound of rippling water and the occasional splash from a fish. I dropped my pack and set up camp. I had a lightweight 1-person tent, a good down sleeping bag, and a compact camp stove. I gathered a bit of dead wood, enough for a small fire later, then took off my boots and sat on a large flat rock to soak in the silence. There was something about being totally alone that felt clean and uncluttered. No buzzing of appliances, no hum of traffic, just the simple background of nature. Around sunset, I cooked a simple meal, rice and beans with a bit of hot sauce, and watched the sky change color over the lake. I made a small fire after that. Nothing too big, just enough to warm my hands and crackle for company. I didn't stay up long. Once the sun dropped, the temperature went with it, and I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in for the night. I slept lightly that first night. It always takes me time to adjust to sleeping outdoors. Every little sound, branches creaking, the movement of animals, the wind shifting, sounds sharper. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee, so I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My breath clouded in the air, and the stars above were impossibly bright. There was no moon, but the lake shimmered faintly from the starlight. I took care of business and went back into the tent, and it took a while to fall asleep again. The next morning, I woke early, around 6:30. It was cold, and the ground felt hard under my sleeping mat. I made oatmeal and coffee, took a short walk around the edge of the lake, and just sat for a long time with my notebook, sketching the trees and water. Around mid-morning, I noticed something strange. There were fresh boot prints near the edge of the lake, leading from the trail and circling partway around the camp. At first I thought they might have been mine, but I checked the tread marks and saw that they didn't match my boots. Mine had a distinct X pattern on the sole. These had a blocky rectangular design. The prints were deep, like whoever made them was heavier than me or carrying a lot of weight. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the woods about 20 yards from my tent. There were no other signs, no gear, no wrappers, no broken branches that I could see. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it could have been a hunter or another hiker who passed through before sunrise. I hadn't heard anything in the night, so they probably weren't trying to bother me. Still, I kept scanning the trees more often after that. By noon, I'd shaken it off. I hiked along the north side of the lake for about a mile, trying to spot deer or elk, took some photos, then came back to camp. I cooked lunch, just soup from a packet, and read for a while. The day passed quietly. Around 5 p.m., as the light started to go golden, I decided to gather more firewood. That's when I found something that turned my stomach cold. About 50 feet behind my tent, deeper in the trees, there was a small pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. Neatly stacked, 6 or 7 of them, balanced too carefully to be accidental. At the base of the stack was a dead bird, a small black one, maybe a starling or a sparrow. Its wings splayed out like someone had arranged them. No blood, but the neck looked twisted. I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to dismantle the pile and bury the bird, but something stopped me. I didn't want to touch it. I walked back to camp without the firewood. I kept telling myself it could have been a weird coincidence. Maybe an animal died and the rocks had been part of a game someone played a week earlier. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food and stayed inside my tent, flashlight off. The sounds outside felt different now. Tense, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept my knife within reach and barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something moving near the lake. 2 sharp cracks, like someone stepping on a branch, then silence. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I decided I would pack up and head out early. I hadn't seen anyone, but something felt off. The boot prints, the bird, the sounds at night. It was adding up. I unzipped the tent just after sunrise and felt that punch of cold air hit me. As I stepped out, I froze. On the flat rock where I had sat the day before was a single object, my small folding camp shovel. I'd left it inside my pack. Now it was standing upright, handle down, blade pointed at the sky, balanced in the exact center of the rock. No note, no other sign, just the shovel placed there deliberately. I didn't bother with breakfast. I packed everything as fast as I could, checking over my shoulder constantly. It took me less than 20 minutes to get moving. My pack was heavier now because I didn't repack it carefully, just shoved things in. As I hiked out, every sound in the forest made me jump. The trail seemed longer, harder to follow. Once or twice I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, there was nothing. I started talking to myself under my breath, just to keep from freaking out. When I reached the car, I almost cried from relief. I tossed my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove back toward town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the road. But there was no one. I didn't tell anyone about it right away. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I wasn't sure what had actually happened. Nothing technically did happen. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen. I never saw another person. But whoever was out there had been watching me, moving around camp, leaving things. That felt worse than if something had happened. It meant they chose not to do anything, but made sure I knew they could. About a week later, I drove back out that way during the day. I didn't hike in. I just parked at the same pull-off and looked down the trail for a long time. Then I got back in the car and left. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still love the woods, still go hiking and backpacking, but I bring someone with me now. I always check for cell signal and I bring extra gear just in case. That trip changed how I think about being alone out there. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Someone was close, too close, and they never said a word. I had always enjoyed being alone in the woods. There was something calming about being surrounded by trees, away from roads and people and phones buzzing in your pocket every 5 minutes. Back in the summer of 2018, when I was 33, I took a week off from my job in Omaha and drove out to a stretch of forestland in northern Idaho, not far from a little town called Priest River. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I'd found some maps online and picked a dispersed camping spot about 2 miles off an old service road. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be around. I had an old Toyota Tacoma and packed it with enough gear to stay out for 5 or 6 days. A 2-person tent, an inflatable sleeping pad, a small cooler with food, a little propane stove, basic medical stuff, my hatchet, flashlight, and a new handheld GPS that I had just bought but hadn't really used much. I had a printed map too, just in case. The first day was peaceful. I parked where the dirt road ended, threw my pack over my shoulders, and hiked in following a faint game trail. After about 45 minutes, I found a small clearing, surrounded by trees but with enough space for my tent. It looked like someone had camped there before. There was a flattened patch in the grass and a couple of rocks in a circle like a fire ring. I set up camp, rolled out my gear, and cooked some canned chili as the sun dropped. That night, I lay in the tent listening to wind move through the trees. No traffic, no airplanes, just the sound of the forest breathing around me. The next day, I spent hiking around the area. I brought my small day pack and followed a narrow deer trail north, then veered off into thicker woods. I didn't see any large animals, but I found tracks. Elk, maybe moose, and something that looked like bear. I made a mental note of that and turned around after a couple of hours. The GPS worked well, and I marked my camp as a waypoint just to be safe. Back at camp, I sat by the cold fire ring and sharpened my knife for a while, mostly out of boredom. I ate early and crawled into my tent with a book and a headlamp. Just before falling asleep, I heard a heavy crack in the woods behind the tent. It wasn't an animal sound exactly, not the rustle of something rooting around or scurrying. It sounded like a branch breaking under weight. It was distant, maybe 30 yards off. I held my breath and waited. Nothing else happened. After a few minutes, I went back to reading, but I left the knife closer to my sleeping bag. The third day started the same. Quiet, still, peaceful. I boiled water for coffee, sat on a stump, and watched a squirrel throw pine cones from a tree. Around noon, I followed a stream I'd found the day before. It led downhill for a while and eventually opened up to a rocky basin with clear water and some mossy boulders. I sat there for an hour just listening to the water. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I checked the GPS. I was over 2 miles from camp. Still, I had plenty of daylight left, so I walked back slowly, taking pictures of mushrooms and bark textures along the way. When I got back to camp that evening, something felt off. I couldn't say exactly what it was, but I stood at the edge of the clearing for a while, scanning everything. The tent was still standing, and my pack was right where I'd left it inside. Nothing looked moved, but the cooler had been dragged about 5 feet away from where I'd placed it, and it was tipped onto its side. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten to it, but there were no claw marks, no torn packaging, nothing missing. It had just been pulled over and left. I stood still for a long time, listening. The air felt different, heavy, like it did before a storm, but the sky was clear. I picked up the cooler and placed it back where it had been. Then I walked a slow circle around the clearing, trying to find tracks or any sign of who or what had been there. I found nothing. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting. At one point, just past midnight, I heard a low thud, like something hitting the ground. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, listening with every muscle tensed. The noise didn't come again, and eventually I fell back asleep out of sheer exhaustion. On the fourth morning, I woke to find a strange set of marks near the edge of the camp. They were faint, like something had been dragged through the grass. Long, sweeping lines. It didn't look like an animal path. It looked too controlled, too neat. I followed them a few yards before they faded out near some roots. I stood there for a while, then turned back to camp. That was when I noticed something else. The fire ring rocks had been moved. Not by much, but two of them were shifted inward, almost like someone had tried to build it up again. That's when I started to seriously consider leaving early. Still, I stayed another night. I don't really know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I'd been chased out by nothing. I stayed close to camp all day, listening more carefully, checking the perimeter over and over. I kept the hatchet at my side the whole time. As evening came, I didn't cook anything. I didn't want to make noise or smells. I just ate a protein bar and sat in the tent, waiting for dark. That night was the worst. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was faint, but it was real, just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate, shallow breathing. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The breathing went on for at least a full minute. Then it stopped. Not because the person or thing walked off, just like someone holding their breath. I waited another 10 minutes, counting each second, and then I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent slowly. There was nothing there. Just darkness. I scanned with the flashlight but saw only trees and dirt and the pale gray of my cooler. No movement, no sign anyone had been there. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed everything as fast as I could. I was done. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up the fire ring. I just took what I could carry and left the rest. As I hiked back, I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my truck and locked the doors. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, after I got home, I unpacked and noticed something strange. The GPS still had the waypoints saved. I opened the track log to look at where I'd gone, maybe to make a little map for future reference. But there was something wrong. There were 2 tracks leading into the woods. One was mine. The other started later after mine. It followed the same path for a while, almost perfectly, but with a slight delay, like someone had been following me, using my own trail as a guide. Then it veered off near the stream, looped around the basin, and came within about 50 feet of my camp. The device only logged active movement when it was turned on, which meant this had been recorded while I slept, probably during that night when I heard the breathing. I've never gone back to that part of Idaho. I still camp, but only in places where I can see other people. Places with signs and rangers and noise. I think someone was watching me that week. Maybe more than one night. Maybe the whole time. I don't know if they wanted to scare me or hurt me or just play some kind of sick game. But whatever they wanted, I'm just glad I left when I did. And I never camp without a trail camera now. Even when I'm alone, I want proof of who else might be out there. I went camping alone in late September 2021, just outside of Cody, Wyoming. I was 32 at the time and had been working a desk job in Billings, Montana for 6 years. Life had started to feel stale, too routine, and I was getting tired of always being in front of a screen. I'd been thinking a lot about disconnecting for a while, so I decided to take a week off work and head down south with my gear. I wanted to hike, camp, and just be out in the woods with no signal, no noise, and no people. I chose a national forest area about an hour-and-a-half drive from Cody. I'd been there once before with friends, but this time I was going deeper, well off the usual trails. My plan was to park near a fire service road, then hike in about 5 miles to a clearing I had found on some topo maps. There was a small stream nearby and the elevation was just over 6,000 feet, which meant it would be cold at night but still manageable during the day. I brought all my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, water filter, bear spray, knife, flashlight, and my old Ruger .22 pistol, which I rarely ever carried but felt like I should this time. I left Billings early in the morning, made it down to Cody by 10 a.m., and by noon I had my car parked off the gravel road and was heading into the woods. The first hour of hiking was peaceful. The path I followed was barely visible, just game trails and some old ATV tracks from what looked like years ago. I walked slow, trying to take it all in. Tall pines, crisp air, the rustling of wind through trees, and the occasional scurry of squirrels or chipmunks. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on the map. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of dry ground with a few large rocks around, a narrow stream about 40 yards to the east, and just enough tree cover to keep the wind down. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, and gathered some fallen branches for a small fire. I wasn't planning to burn much, just enough for warmth at night and to boil water. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No bugs, no birds, no howling, just wind and trees. I remember waking up once around 3 a.m., feeling like something had brushed against the outside of the tent. I laid still for a while, my heart ticking faster than it should have. I listened but heard nothing after that. I figured it was probably a branch or maybe a curious raccoon. Still, it was enough to make me grip the handle of the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. The next day, I hiked around the area. There was an old deer blind made of branches about a mile west of the camp. It looked like no one had used it in years. I found some tracks, elk mostly, and followed them for a while but never saw any animals. Around 5 p.m., I made it back to camp, filtered some water, and cooked a packet of chili. As the sun went down, I felt that strange quiet again. No birds chirping, no owls hooting, just silence. My instincts started to hum, not loudly, but enough to keep me alert. I couldn't put my finger on why. The third day is when things really shifted. Around noon, I was hiking north of camp, just exploring a ridge, when I found something strange. There was a small metal pot, like a camping pot, sitting under a tree. It had burn marks on the bottom, like it had been used recently. It was clean, no food inside, but it was definitely not old. A few feet away was a torn piece of black nylon fabric. Looked like it might have come from a backpack. I scanned the area but saw no one, no other gear, no signs of a campsite. Felt wrong. There was no logical reason for someone to be this deep without the rest of their stuff. If they were hiking or camping, there should have been more. A tent, pack, food wrappers, something. But there was nothing. I brought the pot back to my camp. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find whoever it belonged to and give it back. Or maybe I just wanted it away from where I found it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that fabric and pot. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside again. This time, it wasn't a brush or wind. It was a clear, deliberate step. Then another. Slow. Heavy. Too heavy to be a raccoon or fox. I held my breath and reached for the pistol. I didn't unzip the tent or move. I just laid there, gripping the gun and staring into the dark above me. Then it stopped. No more footsteps, just nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped out and looked around. The ground was damp from dew, and I scanned for tracks. About 20 feet from the tent, I found a partial print. It looked like a boot, heavy tread, not mine. It was pointed toward the tent, then veered off into the woods. I followed it for a while, but the trail was hard to keep. The forest floor was too dry in most places. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right away. Another part didn't want to believe anything was wrong. Maybe someone else was out here, maybe a hunter or hiker who got lost or wandered too far. But they were close enough to walk up to my tent in the middle of the night and just stand there. That day, I stayed close to camp. I kept the fire going longer than usual, trying to make noise. I even hung some bright gear outside to make it obvious that someone was here. But no one came, no sounds, no sign of anyone. That night, I kept the gun next to me again. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the noise, a twig snapping, then a faint rustling. I sat up and waited, eyes wide, listening hard. There were no other steps, just that one sound. Then silence. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they were behind my tent. Same boot tread. They circled around and led back toward the direction of the ridge. I knew then I had to leave. I packed everything fast, barely ate, and started the hike back toward the car. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every small sound made me stop and listen. I didn't see anyone, but I never shook the feeling that someone was watching. I reached the car by early afternoon. Everything was how I left it. No signs of damage. No other vehicles nearby. I got in and started driving. As I pulled out onto the gravel road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. About 50 yards back in the tree line, there was a figure standing still. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. I made it back to Billings that night. Didn't unpack right away. I sat on the couch for a long time, just thinking. I kept that metal pot I found. I don't know why. Maybe as a reminder. Maybe to prove to myself it really happened. A week later, I reported the incident to the forest ranger station in Cody. I told them about the tracks, the figure, and the pot. They took notes but didn't seem surprised. They said it was possible someone else was out there, maybe squatting or hiding. They had no reports of missing persons recently, but they said they'd send someone to check it out. I haven't been back since. I still go camping, but never that deep and never alone. I learned something on that trip. It's not just animals that make the woods dangerous. Sometimes it's people. And the scariest part is not knowing who they are, or what they want, or how long they've been watching. All I know is I got out. I got home. And I don't think I'll ever go that far into the woods again. Not alone. Not ever. I was 31 when I took that solo trip into the forests of western Montana. It was the summer of 2017, and I had been working long weeks at a construction firm in Boise. My back hurt most mornings, and I was feeling worn out, like everything in life was moving too fast and all I ever did was work, eat, sleep, and start again. So I decided to get away from all of it for a while, just a few days, somewhere deep in nature where there was no signal, no emails, no alarms. I packed my gear, drove north, and found a trail that branched off Highway 12, about 30 miles west of Lolo. There was a dirt road that wound up toward the Bitterroot Range, and I followed it until my truck couldn't handle the rocks anymore. I parked it on the side of the road, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The air smelled like pine and warm dust. It was quiet, real quiet. I could hear my own footsteps crunching over the dry needles and the occasional buzz of an insect passing my ear. The trail wasn't official. It was just a narrow path that cut through the underbrush and rose steadily into the woods. I had my GPS watch, a compass, and a topographical map, and I'd studied the area the night before. I felt prepared. I'd done solo hikes before, but not this deep into the wild. That's what I wanted. I hiked about 7 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. There was a narrow stream about 50 feet away, barely a few inches deep but clean and cold. I boiled water from it and made some rice and canned chicken over my little camp stove. I stretched out on my sleeping pad and stared up through the trees until it got too dark to see. I had no cell signal, which felt good at first. My mind quieted down. I slept hard that night with the sound of the stream in the background. The second day, I wandered farther from camp. I left most of my gear behind and took just the essentials in a day pack: water, food, my map, compass, bear spray, and a small med kit. I followed the stream uphill. It led me to a small glacial pond surrounded by rocks and moss. I sat there for a long time, just watching a hawk circle overhead. There were no other hikers, no voices, no human noise at all. Around late afternoon, I started heading back. When I got close to camp, I noticed something odd. A rock had been moved. It was a flat, round one I'd used to anchor one corner of my tent. It had shifted a few feet to the side. The tent wasn't collapsed, just loose on one end. I figured maybe the wind had picked up, or I'd placed it on uneven ground. I fixed it, checked my gear, and nothing else looked disturbed. Still, it left a weird feeling in my chest, like something small had shifted in the background. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The woods felt different. The sounds were the same: crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the water trickling. But it all felt too quiet between the sounds, like there was something holding its breath out there. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something large moving through the trees. Not a squirrel or a rabbit. This was slow, heavy. It moved behind my tent, then paused. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding. I didn't shine it out the tent flap. I just sat there holding it, waiting. After a few minutes, the noise moved off. Could have been a deer, maybe even a black bear. I hadn't seen any scat nearby, but it was possible. Still, it felt deliberate, like it knew where I was. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked around the camp. There were no tracks, but the ground was dry and hard. A few broken branches, but nothing conclusive. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe even just me overreacting to normal forest sounds. Still, something had shifted in my mindset. I was alert in a way I hadn't been before. I decided to cut my trip down from 5 days to 3. That day, I packed up camp slowly, deciding I'd hike closer to the trailhead and set up for one more night before heading out completely. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something strange again. One of my food bags, which I'd hung in a tree maybe 30 feet from camp, was gone. The cord was still there, the knot intact, dangling empty. The bag had been torn off. I looked around for it, thinking maybe it had fallen. I found it about 10 feet away, shredded, with the wrappers and empty cans scattered nearby. That wasn't normal for a bear. Bears usually try to get the whole bag down. This looked like someone had cut or yanked it loose. I checked the tree more carefully. The bark had scrape marks, not claw marks, like someone had climbed it with boots or maybe used something metal to reach up. I couldn't shake the feeling that a person had been here, watching. I felt it in my spine. I started hiking back toward my truck, faster than before. I kept turning around, checking the trail behind me. Nothing. No sounds, no signs. Just trees and silence. The trail twisted and rose and dipped for miles. By the time I found a new spot to camp, it was near dusk. I picked a spot near a rock outcrop, where I could see the trail from above. I decided not to build a fire. I ate cold food from a can and lay down in my sleeping bag without setting up the tent. I wanted to be ready to move quickly. I stayed awake most of that night. Every sound made my skin tighten. I kept my flashlight and bear spray close. Around 3 a.m., I saw a light moving through the trees below me. Not a fire, not a flicker, an LED beam. Like a headlamp, it moved slowly side to side, searching. It was too far to make out a shape, but it was a person. Definitely a person. And they weren't on the trail. They were cutting through the woods parallel to it, but off to the side. It didn't look like someone lost. They moved with purpose. I lay completely still, breathing through my nose, afraid even to blink. The light stayed in view for maybe 5 minutes. Then it went dark, just disappeared. I didn't sleep at all after that. By first light, I was on my feet and moving. I skipped breakfast, just drank water and got out. The trail felt longer on the way back. My legs ached, and I kept imagining footsteps behind me. At one point I stopped, trying to listen, and I swear I heard twigs snap behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing, just trees and shadow. When I finally reached the road, my truck was still there, undisturbed. But there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt next to it. Not mine. They were wider and deeper, like from an older pickup or SUV with heavy tires. I hadn't seen another car when I arrived 3 days before, and this road didn't lead to any houses or campsites. Whoever had been out there had come after me. I got in and drove without stopping. Didn't even change my clothes until I was back in Idaho. I didn't report anything to the Forest Service because technically, nothing happened. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, not just passing through, watching. For weeks after, I kept looking over my shoulder. At the grocery store, at the gas station, I bought a security camera for my apartment. I told myself it was all just to be cautious. I didn't go hiking again for over a year. When I finally did, I stuck to well-marked trails, places where I'd pass other people every hour or so. I never went that deep into the woods alone again. Looking back, I think what scared me most wasn't the idea of an animal or even getting lost. It was the realization that someone had been following me, close enough to take food, close enough to watch me at night. And they never said a word, never made themselves fully known, just enough to make sure I knew they were there, like it was all a game to them. I got away safe, yeah, but I don't think it was luck. I think whoever it was didn't want to hurt me. Not then. Not that time. Maybe they were just practicing. Or maybe they just didn't get the chance. Either way, I'll never camp alone like that again. Some places aren't as empty as they seem. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2022. I lived in Southern Oregon at the time, in a small town called Glendale, working remotely as a freelance survey technician. Most of my days were spent staring at maps and topography lines on a screen. I had gone camping a few times growing up, mostly with my uncle and cousins, but never truly by myself. That summer, I'd been feeling burnt out and anxious from the isolation of working from home, and I thought being out in nature for a few days might help clear my head. I didn't want to go anywhere too crowded or well-known. After doing some searching online, I came across an old blog post about a place called Little Rock Lake, deep in the Fremont-Winema National Forest. The article mentioned that it was remote, not maintained anymore by the Forest Service, and rarely visited. That was perfect for what I wanted: peace and quiet, no cell service, and a chance to completely disconnect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers of food and water, a portable stove, some basic fishing gear, bear spray, a knife, and an emergency satellite beacon just in case. I also brought a paper map of the area since I couldn't rely on my phone out there. It was a 3-hour drive from Glendale, most of it on back roads, and the last stretch was a winding dirt path full of potholes and fallen branches. I didn't see another car for nearly an hour once I turned off the highway. When I finally reached the spot marked on the map, there wasn't much to it. A clearing just big enough to park the truck, and a faint path that led into the trees. No signage, no designated campsites, just a thinning of pine trees and an overgrown trail. I left the truck tucked behind some brush and followed the path with my gear. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw the lake, small, surrounded by dense forest, and completely still. It didn't even look like the wind ever touched it. There was a clearing along the shore, just big enough to pitch a tent. I set up camp and spent the rest of the evening organizing things, collecting firewood, and fishing off a log that jutted into the water. I didn't catch anything, but it didn't matter. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the buzzing of insects, and the last bit of sunlight made the lake look like glass. I felt better almost immediately. When night came, I sat by the fire, ate a can of soup, and stared at the flames until the cold made me crawl into my sleeping bag. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up a few times because of how quiet it was. Too quiet. At home, I always heard distant cars or the hum of appliances. Out there, once the fire died, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the distant hoot of an owl. Took some time to get used to. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and ate granola while sitting on a flat rock by the lake. I decided to hike around the shoreline to see if there were better spots or maybe trails leading elsewhere. I brought a small backpack with water, a snack, and a whistle. The terrain around the lake was rough, with thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and uneven rocks. I moved slowly, trying to make sure I didn't twist an ankle or lose track of my location. About an hour into the hike, I found something strange. It was a large tree, split down the middle and blackened at the base like it had been hit by lightning. But the surrounding trees were untouched, and there hadn't been any storms in the area for weeks according to the forecast. Around the tree were dozens of small, broken branches stacked in what looked like a pattern, a wide circle. It didn't look natural. I crouched down and poked at them with a stick, but didn't touch anything with my hands. My first thought was that someone had camped there a while ago and made some sort of fire ring or marker, but there were no ashes, no trash, nothing else. I took a few steps back and looked around. I didn't see any footprints or signs of people, but I felt something then, a weird weight in my chest, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just forest. I stood still for a while, trying to make sense of the feeling, but it didn't go away until I walked away from the spot. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just spooked because I was alone and not used to that level of silence. I spent the rest of the day reading a paperback, trying to fish again, and adding more wood to my supply. That night, I made a small fire and watched the stars come out, trying not to think about that split tree. But something changed that night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound soft but steady. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, listening. It was like a thudding or maybe footsteps, but they were irregular. Not close, not right outside the tent, but out in the woods. I couldn't tell the direction, and it stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, I walked around the immediate area, looking for anything out of place. I didn't find tracks or signs of animals, but I did notice that one of the smaller branches I'd collected and leaned against a stump was now on the ground, broken in half. It could have been nothing. Maybe it fell or I'd stepped on it earlier without noticing, but it made me uneasy. I thought about leaving, but I also didn't want to seem paranoid. I told myself it was just forest sounds, animals moving through the brush, maybe deer. I stayed another night. That was the worst one. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, slow, deliberate. I sat up and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned down to embers, but the moon was bright enough to see silhouettes. I scanned the trees, heart pounding, holding the bear spray in one hand and the knife in the other. I stayed like that for at least 10 minutes. Then I saw movement, just a flicker at the edge of the trees, something ducking behind a trunk. Not an animal. It was too upright. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body locked. My mouth was dry, and I felt sweat run down my neck despite the cold. Whoever or whatever it was didn't come closer. After what felt like an hour, the forest was still again. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the knife beside me, the bear spray in my hand, and waited for sunrise. As soon as it was light, I packed everything up. Tent, gear, coolers, everything went back in the truck. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just got out. The drive back felt endless. Every time I turned down a stretch of road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone following, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. When I got home, I looked up reports of missing people or strange encounters in that area. I didn't find anything, just old blog posts, trail reviews, and a few articles about forest fires years back. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe just a hunter passing through who didn't want to be seen. But I know what I saw. Something upright, something aware of me, and something that didn't want me there. I haven't gone camping since. I still spend time outside, but I stay close to towns now. I'll walk forest trails, sure, but I always go with a friend, and I never go off-trail. That trip changed the way I think about solitude. I wanted peace and quiet, but what I got was something else entirely. There was no moment of confrontation, no final scare, no dramatic escape. But what happened was real, too real, and that's what makes it stick with me. Not the silence of the forest, but the feeling that I was never truly alone out there. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life. I was 29 years old, working a demanding office job in the heart of Denver, and I needed some time to unwind. The idea of being alone in nature, surrounded by trees and the quiet hum of the wild, was just what I needed. So, I packed up my gear and made my way to a campsite in the Pike National Forest. I'd done a lot of solo camping before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of this particular spot or the fact that I hadn't gone camping in nearly a year, but something about the trip felt off from the start. The drive up to the campsite was peaceful enough, with winding roads cutting through thick forests and the occasional mountain vista. I'd booked a spot that was a little off the beaten path, one of those secluded, walk-in sites that required a short hike to reach. Promised solitude and a real connection with nature. Just what I was looking for. The trail to the campsite was about a mile long, and as I hiked up with my heavy pack, I couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of the forest around me. The air smelled fresh, pine needles crunching underfoot as I walked. Birds sang overhead, and squirrels darted from tree to tree. By the time I reached the site, The sun was beginning to set. The campground was nestled in a small valley, with towering trees surrounding it on all sides. A small creek ran nearby, its gentle babbling providing a comforting background noise. There was a fire ring at the center of the site and a flat area where I could set up my tent. The spot seemed perfect for a peaceful night in the woods. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and sat back to relax. The orange glow of the fire flickered in the growing twilight, casting long shadows across the campsite. As the fire crackled, I unpacked my gear and prepared a simple meal, some dehydrated food that I'd brought with me. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet solitude. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but the stillness of the forest seemed unnatural. The animals that had been active earlier had gone silent. No more birds or squirrels. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. My skin tingled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. Of course, there was no one there. After finishing my meal, I decided to turn in for the night. I doused the fire, making sure it was completely out before crawling into my tent. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but I was prepared. I had a good sleeping bag and plenty of layers to keep me warm. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't the peaceful, comforting sounds of nature I'd expected. It was too quiet, too still. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was wrong. It was as though I wasn't alone, though I knew I was. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself straining to hear any sounds in the distance. There was nothing. The silence was suffocating. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a noise, a loud crack, like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. I sat up in my sleeping bag, wide awake now, listening intently. Another crack, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush just outside my tent. My heart began to race, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel the presence out there. Someone or something was watching me. I had no idea what to do. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a hiker? Maybe someone else was camping nearby and had wandered too close to my site? I didn't think so. The campgrounds were all far apart, and the area I was in was known for its seclusion. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent flap just a crack. I scanned the area around the campsite, my light sweeping over the trees and shadows. Nothing. The forest stood still. My breath came in shallow gasps, my eyes darting from one dark corner of the campsite to the next. Still nothing. I slowly zipped the tent back up, my mind running wild with possibilities. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just an animal or the wind. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. The hours dragged on, and I lay awake, every little noise outside making me jump. Finally, at around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off. When I woke up again, it was still dark, but I could hear something, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. The sound came again, closer this time. It was like something was dragging its hand across the side of my tent. I had to stop myself from screaming. I reached for my knife, which was tucked into the pocket of my sleeping bag. My thoughts were a blur, but I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and crept outside. The cool night air hit me, and I shivered in my layers. The flashlight was still clutched in my hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. I scanned the area again, but this time, I didn't just look around the campsite. I looked at the trees, the dark shadows beyond. Nothing, but the dragging sound stopped as soon as I stepped outside. I stood there for a long time, waiting, hoping for some kind of sign. Still, nothing moved. No animals, no wind, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself had frozen in place. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, not daring to fall asleep again. The sun finally came up, and I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things in a hurry, constantly checking over my shoulder. As I walked back down the trail toward the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My pace quickened with every step, my mind racing. But when I finally reached the car, I felt a small sense of relief. As I drove away from the campsite, I looked back one last time. The forest looked peaceful in the morning light, but I couldn't ignore the unease that still gripped me. What had been out there in the dark? Why had I felt so watched, so vulnerable? I'd been alone, but the fear hadn't been of something supernatural or otherworldly. It had been real, something human, maybe, a person or a group lurking in the woods. I never found out who or what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be going back to that campsite. The road back to civilization never felt so comforting. The fire crackled in front of me as I sat hunched over, staring at the orange and red flames. It was late, too late for someone like me to be out in the wilderness. I could feel the cold creeping in, the kind of chill that wraps around your bones, making you wonder if you'll ever get warm again. My breath came out in slow, foggy clouds, the night air thicker with every exhale. My name's Jason, by the way, and this was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I hadn't been to this spot before, some random off-the-map campground in the far corner of Colorado. It was late autumn, the trees standing bare like silent sentinels watching over the land. The colors had already bled from the leaves, leaving behind a scene that felt like a memory half forgotten. There was no one else here, just me and the wilderness. I'd gotten a late start, so by the time I'd set up camp, the sun was almost gone, leaving nothing but a shadowy landscape that made it hard to tell where the trees ended and the sky began. The woods around me were thick, dense with pine and aspen, their bare branches stretching up like gnarled fingers. I had hiked for hours, hoping to find a spot far from the usual crowded campgrounds. I wanted peace, solitude, the kind of isolation where your thoughts could be your own for a while. It sounded perfect. I thought I was being smart. Get in early, set up a tent, build a fire, and settle in. But as the night dragged on, I realized I had underestimated the place. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, just a little. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence. The air didn't carry the usual sounds I was used to when camping. There were no chirping crickets or rustling leaves, no breeze that whispered through the branches. It was just quiet. The only sound was the snap and crackle of the fire. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I kept turning my head, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There was nothing, of course, nothing but trees and shadows. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It grew like a weight pressing against my chest. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire, but then I heard something, a rustle, like something moving in the brush behind me. I jerked my head around, squinting into the darkness. Could have been an animal, I thought, maybe a deer or a fox. But the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't like the usual sounds you hear in the woods, the distant scurrying of wildlife or the occasional crack of a twig. This was deliberate, slow, almost calculated. I stood up, trying to push away the unease that was growing inside me. My boots crunched against the dirt as I moved closer to the edge of the campfire's light. My hands were trembling, and I hated how vulnerable I felt. There was no reason for this. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a chance to disconnect, but now I was feeling like a target. The fire's light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees around me. That's when I heard it again, the rustling closer this time. It came from the woods, just past the tree line, hidden in the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I knew it was there. I grabbed a large stick from the fire and held it out in front of me, my breath shallow and quick. The rustling stopped for a moment, then came again, this time much louder, closer, as if whatever was out there was moving toward me. My heart raced. I stood frozen, my grip tightening on the stick. My mind raced through all the possibilities. wild animal, a lost hiker, maybe even someone just out there to mess with me. The sound didn't stop, came closer and closer, and I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was something alive, something aware. And then, through the dark, I saw movement. A figure, barely a shadow, shifting in the distance between the trees. It was tall, its shape vaguely human, but too tall, too twisted. It didn't move like a person. It was more fluid, more deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I stood there, transfixed, my body frozen in place. The figure stopped. It was still for what felt like an eternity. And then, with sudden, jerking motion, it turned and vanished into the woods. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The only sound in the air was the crackle of the fire, louder now, almost deafening in the silence that followed. When I finally managed to move, I ran. Not toward the figure, but away from it. I bolted for the tent, my hands fumbling as I tried to unzip the flap. It wasn't until I was inside, the door zipped tight behind me, that I let out the breath I'd been holding in. But even as I sat there, hunched in the small, cramped space, the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't just the fear, it was the uncertainty. I didn't know what I'd seen. I didn't know if it was a person or some kind of animal or something else entirely. But I knew it was out there, and it was watching me. I spent the rest of the night in that tent, listening to every little noise, every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every time my eyes closed, I saw that figure, tall, twisted, impossible. I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something had been out there. And whatever it was, it hadn't gone far. The next morning, I woke up to the light of the rising sun filtering through the trees. It felt like a different world than the one I'd woken up to the night before. The air was clear, crisp, and full of life again. Birds chirped in the distance, the soft rustling of leaves the only sound. I could almost convince myself that it had all been a dream. But when I crawled out of the tent and saw the ground around my camp, my heart sank. There, in the dirt just outside my tent, were large, unmistakable tracks. The prints were deep, like something heavy had been walking around my camp. The tracks circled the perimeter of the site, stopping just short of the fire, as if whatever it was had been observing me throughout the night. The prints were too large to be from any animal I knew, too deep, too deliberate. I don't know what I thought I would do. I'd planned to leave immediately, but something in me was still holding me there, staring at those prints. Something about them felt off, like they didn't belong. I packed up my things, every noise outside sounding like a threat, and I made my way back to the car. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with everything I'd seen. The walk back felt too quiet, too empty. Every step seemed like a journey deeper into something I couldn't quite grasp. When I reached the trailhead, I looked back. The woods were still there, as silent and vast as ever. But the figure, whatever it was gone. The tracks, too, had faded. The forest had swallowed it all up again. I drove out of there fast, never looking back. It wasn't the peace I had been seeking, but the relief of leaving that place was enough to make me promise I'd never return. There's a lesson in all of this. Sometimes the woods are too quiet for a reason. And when you go looking for solitude, you might find something that's better left unseen. It was early October of 2019 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in Denver, working as a freelance web developer, and slowly burning out. My eyes hurt from too much screen time, my sleep was a mess, and I hadn't taken a proper break in more than 2 years. So I rented a small off-grid cabin in northern Idaho, close to a lake called Lake Pendorile. I found it on a listing site for off-grid getaways. No power, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a generator if I needed it and a propane heater for the cold. I brought enough supplies for 10 days. Canned food, freeze-dried meals, water jugs, a few books, a first aid kit, batteries, flashlights, a hand crank radio, a thick sleeping bag, and a journal I hadn't written in since college. I also brought a 9mm pistol. I wasn't paranoid, but the idea of being deep in the woods alone made me feel better having it. I'd used guns growing up in Kansas, knew how to handle one, and just liked the peace of mind. The cabin was about a mile from the main gravel road, reachable by a narrow, unmaintained dirt trail that twisted through dense forest. I drove my 4Runner as far as I could, parked under a leaning pine tree, and hiked the rest with my gear in 2 trips. The air smelled like cold pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were my boots on the ground and the occasional bird rustling high above. The place was smaller than the pictures made it look, just a single room with a cot, a wood stove, a folding table, and a little kitchenette with a propane burner. There was a composting toilet in a shed out back, and a metal bin raised off the ground to keep food away from animals. No insulation to speak of, just logs and gaps sealed with old chinking. I liked it instantly. It was rough and quiet and exactly what I needed. The first few days passed in slow, pleasant rhythm. I'd wake with the sun, boil water for coffee on the burner, eat something simple, then hike around the area. I had brought some topo maps and marked out a few trails that looped through the forest. I saw deer, fresh moose tracks, and once spotted a bear's paw print in the mud near a creek. I kept my pistol on my belt whenever I wandered more than 100 yards from the cabin. By the 4th day, I'd settled into a steady groove.
I rid, I hiked, I cooked, I chopped 4 wood.
I wasn't using the generator at all, just relying on daylight and headlamps. I felt healthier than I had in months. But that night, something changed. Started small. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to piss. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped into my boots, and stepped outside. The moon was barely out, a thin white sliver in the sky, and everything else was dark. The trees loomed like black walls. I walked to the edge of the clearing, relieved myself, and turned back toward the cabin when I heard a crunch behind me. It wasn't a branch falling. It was weight, something heavy pressing down on leaves and twigs. I froze, light off, breath held. Another crunch, this time closer. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing, just trunks, shadows, and silence. I waited, listening, for maybe 2 minutes. Nothing more. I went back inside, locked the door, and lay in the cot with the pistol on my chest. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a moose, maybe even just a tree shifting in the wind. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I hiked less that day, staying close to the cabin, keeping the pistol nearby. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. Scratches on the side of the food bin, bent branches on the trail I'd walked yesterday, and what looked like a piece of torn cloth snagged on a bush. It was dark green, almost camo, and looked weathered, like it had been there a while. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat inside with the lights off, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not animal movement. Not the darting steps of a raccoon or fox. Slow, deliberate steps. 2-legged. They circled the cabin once, then again. I kept the gun in my hand, heart hammering in my chest, breath shallow. I stayed silent. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the door, didn't speak. Just walked, then disappeared back into the woods. I waited until dawn before I moved again. The next day I packed. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care about the money I'd already spent. I could hike out, reach my truck, and head back to Denver. But when I got to the trail, I found something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Several sets. They weren't mine. I had hiking boots with a specific tread. These were flatter, maybe work boots or old military style. They came from the woods and followed the same trail I used to hike in. I turned back to the cabin, not sure what else to do. I checked the area around the food bin and found more signs. The lid had been moved slightly, and a few items were gone. A can of chili, a bag of trail mix. My stomach nodded. Someone had been watching me, maybe for days, maybe longer. I scanned the trees with my binoculars and saw nothing. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I kept the pistol in a holster on my hip now, even inside the cabin. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night. I didn't light fires anymore. I ate cold food. I kept the generator off, the lights off, and the windows covered. But the footsteps came back. Sometimes I'd hear them at 2 or 3 in the morning. Sometimes just after sunset. Always slow, always circling. I started to see things too, rocks stacked near the edge of the clearing, like tiny markers. A stick stuck upright in the ground with a strip of cloth tied to the top. A fresh boot print in the mud near the outhouse. The worst part was the silence. Whoever it was, they never spoke, never made noise besides those slow steps. They never approached while I was outside, never made a sound during the day. I started to lose track of time. I marked each day in my journal with a slash, but I couldn't remember if I had been there 7 days or 9 or 10. The sky stayed gray, the forest cold and wet. On what I guessed was the 9th day, I found something that broke me a little. I had a solar-powered trail cam I set up near one of the game trails for fun, just to see what passed by at night. I hadn't checked it in a few days, so I took it inside and scrolled through the photos. At first it was normal: deer, a raccoon, a squirrel. Then one frame showed a man, mid-30s, maybe 40s, scruffy beard, dark clothes, heavy jacket, no pack, just standing, half turned away from the camera. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago, around 3:18 a.m. I stared at that photo for an hour. I didn't recognize him. He looked thin, worn down, like someone who'd lived rough for a long time. His eyes were just barely visible in the image, and they looked blank, like there was nothing behind them, just emptiness. I deleted the photo and took the SD card out of the cam. I smashed the camera with a rock. That night I stayed up again, pistol in hand, back to the wall, facing the door. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard the first step, then another, closer. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. Dead silence. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Not hard, not aggressive, just enough to test it. I raised the gun, breath locked in my throat. I didn't move. The knob stopped. Then footsteps again, fading. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I made my decision. I packed everything I could carry and left the rest. I had to get out now. I hiked to my truck as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the vehicle, I found something that made me freeze again. The driver's side mirror had been pushed in. It didn't break, just folded like someone had walked by and bumped it. There were fresh muddy prints by the door. I unlocked it, got in, and drove out fast. The whole way down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out into the trail behind me. I never did. I drove straight to Sandpoint and rented a cheap motel room. I stayed 2 nights, showered 3 times, slept with the lights on, and kept the gun on the nightstand. I didn't go back to Denver right away. I just needed to feel normal again. I looked up missing persons reports in the area. There were a few, mostly hikers or campers who never came back, but nothing recent. Nothing I could link to what happened. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, told them someone might be living out there, possibly stealing food, maybe watching cabins. They took notes, thanked me, and that was it. I never heard back from them. I never went back to Idaho. I never even finished the journal entries. I threw the whole thing out when I got home. Sometimes I still think about that man in the trail cam photo, his face, his eyes. I don't think he wanted to hurt me. If he did, he had plenty of chances. I think he just wanted to scare me, or maybe warn me, or maybe that's just what I tell myself so I can sleep at night. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never off-grid, never without cell service. And I always park where I can see the road. Always. I took a week off in early October of 2017 to clear my head. I had just turned 35, recently gone through a breakup, and I needed some time away from everything. I booked a small, off-grid cabin in northern Idaho, a few miles outside a small town called Bonner's Ferry. It was one of those listings that didn't show up on most travel sites, and I found it by chance through a forum where people shared quiet, remote getaways. The owner emailed me a PDF with directions, said there was no cell service and no Wi-Fi, and advised bringing enough supplies since the nearest store was about 45 minutes away. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just me, some paperbacks, a fishing rod, a bunch of canned food, and some good boots. The cabin was deep in the forest, about a mile off a gravel road that wound through a dense stretch of pine and birch. I had to leave my car at a clearing and hike the rest of the way in with my backpack. The trail was narrow and covered with damp leaves. Felt like I was walking through a tunnel made of trees. The air was cold, but not freezing, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the wind brushing through the branches. When I reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. One story, dark brown wood siding, a steep roof, a small porch with a couple of chairs, and a metal chimney poking out the top. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a couple of oil lanterns, a hand pump for water out back, and a composting toilet in a shed a few feet away. It smelled faintly of old wood and pine smoke. I liked it immediately. The first few days went by peacefully. I spent mornings fishing at a nearby creek, afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings watching the fire inside the stove flicker and glow. There was a calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't think about work, my ex, or anything else. I just let myself sink into the rhythm of the place. The woods felt safe at first. Everything was quiet. A few squirrels, some birds, a couple of deer passing through the brush. Once I even saw a fox trotting along the edge of the tree line, completely unaware of me. There were no strange noises, no signs of people, no litter or trails aside from the one I'd used to get in. It was isolated but peaceful. The first odd thing I noticed happened on the fourth night. I was in bed, the fire dying down in the stove, and I heard something out in the woods. It wasn't a loud sound, just a single, deliberate crunch of dry leaves. Not the rustling of a deer or the fluttering of wings. It sounded like a boot stepping on the ground. Just one step, then nothing. I sat up in bed and listened for a long time. The fire crackled softly, and the wind moaned against the cabin walls. But I didn't hear the sound again. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe a tree limb falling. Maybe an animal stepped on something hard. I didn't want to let my imagination start spinning. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The air felt heavier, like the trees had closed in just a little more overnight. I brushed it off and went back to my routine. I hiked a little farther than usual that day, looking for a spot I'd seen on a topographic map where two small creeks crossed. It was a quiet, beautiful place, and I sat there for a while with my feet in the water, just listening to the stream. I didn't want to rush back to the cabin. When I did get back late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of the chairs on the porch had been moved. I always pushed them against the wall when I wasn't using them, and now one of them was turned outward, facing the woods. I stopped walking and just stared at it for a while. There was no wind strong enough to do that, and I was sure no animals could have moved it like that. I went around the cabin again, checked all the windows and looked for footprints. The ground was mostly pine needles and moss, so it was hard to tell. I didn't see anything that screamed someone was here, but I also knew I hadn't left the chair that way. That night, I made sure the door was locked. The cabin had a heavy bolt, and I slid it shut before blowing out the lantern. I kept the hatchet I used for chopping wood next to the bed, just in case. I didn't really think I'd need it, but it made me feel better. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound on the porch. It was soft, like someone trying not to be heard. A creak of wood under slow, deliberate steps. I didn't move. I just lay there, holding my breath, staring at the ceiling. The steps moved toward the door, paused, then walked slowly along the side of the cabin toward the back. I couldn't see anything from where I was lying, and I wasn't about to light the lantern or open the door. After a few minutes, the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept listening for any other noise. I imagined someone circling the cabin again and again, waiting. The woods no longer felt quiet, they felt dead, like everything had gone still to avoid being seen. At sunrise, I went outside and looked around. No signs of anyone. The chair was still turned toward the woods. I checked the hand pump, the toilet shed, even walked a little way into the trees. Nothing. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A bear sniffing around. Something explainable. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I thought about leaving that day, but I had 2 more nights left, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my mind wander too much after being alone so long. Still, I kept the hatchet with me wherever I went, even when I just went to the toilet or fetched water. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't hike or fish. I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and a book, trying to keep my eyes on the tree line. I scanned every movement, every rustle of wind or flash of bird wings. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't relax. As the sun dropped, I stacked more wood by the stove, lit the lanterns early, and double-checked the locks. I didn't even undress when I went to bed. I kept my boots on, just in case I had to get out quickly. I lay in the dark, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, listening. This time, the sound didn't come from the porch. It came from the back of the cabin. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through leaves and dirt. Then a soft knock on the back wall. Just once. Then again. I sat up slowly, reached for the hatchet, and listened. The knocking stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then a third knock, farther away now, like whoever or whatever it was had moved off into the woods. To first light, I packed my things. I was supposed to check out the next morning, but I didn't care. I shoved everything into my pack, made sure the fire was out, and left without even cleaning the dishes I'd used. The trail back to the car felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following me, just behind the bend in the trail. When I reached the clearing where I'd parked, the car was still there. Nothing broken, nothing taken. But I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the hood, written in dirt with a finger, was a single word. Stay. It hadn't been there when I parked. I know that for a fact. I always noticed the dust on my car, especially since I'd driven over those gravel roads. Someone had been there. Someone had come all the way out into the woods, found my car, and left that message. I unlocked the door, threw my backpack in, and drove away as fast as I could without skidding off the road. I didn't stop until I reached the town, and even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror like some lunatic. I filled up with gas, grabbed coffee, and kept driving south until I hit Spokane. I checked into a hotel that night, turned on every light, and barely slept. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner. I deleted the emails, blocked the listing site, and moved on. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time because I didn't want to sound insane. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I think about it often. The footsteps, the knocked wall, the chair turned toward the trees, that word on the hood. They weren't trying to scare me away. They wanted me to stay. It was late September in 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 back then, living in Burlington, working as a freelance web developer, and I had reached a point where I just needed some time away from screens, notifications, and the pressure of meeting deadlines. A friend of mine had inherited an old cabin from his uncle, and he wasn't using it much. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted, as long as I was okay with it being isolated and kind of run down. I liked the sound of that. I needed quiet and I needed space. The cabin was in a heavily forested area near a place called Jay Peak. Not right on the mountain, but tucked about 8 miles away from the nearest paved road. I drove my Subaru up through gravel roads and eventually reached the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. Trees grew thick on both sides. There were no other cabins nearby, just forest, hills, and silence. When I finally reached the place, it looked exactly as he had described. Weathered wood siding, moss growing around the base, a slanted roof with some missing shingles. But it stood solid, and when I stepped inside, I could tell it hadn't been used in a while, but it wasn't falling apart. There was a small kitchen, a main living area with a wood stove, a table, and an old couch. and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and a bathroom that didn't work anymore. The place didn't have running water or electricity, but it did have a generator outside. My friend warned me that the generator worked, but it was old and ate fuel fast. I brought my own supplies: canned food, bottled water, a camping stove, fuel, lanterns, extra batteries, a few changes of clothes, and my sleeping bag. I didn't plan to use the generator unless I really needed to. I liked the idea of staying off the grid. I turned off my phone after I sent a quick message to my brother letting him know I'd be out of touch for a while. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. The weather was cool but clear. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. I spent my time reading, hiking short trails, and just sitting on the porch with a cup of instant coffee in the morning. I'd hear the wind brushing through the trees, the occasional woodpecker hammering into a trunk, and at night, crickets and the distant howls of coyotes. I brought a small notepad and started sketching out some ideas for a new project. I felt better than I had in months. By the third night, things started to shift a little. It rained most of that day, not hard but steady, and the temperature dropped more than I expected. I stayed inside, playing cards with myself and writing. Around 9 or 10 that night, I heard what sounded like someone walking on the leaves outside. I figured it was just a deer or some other animal. I turned off my lantern early and climbed into my sleeping bag, listening to the soft thuds of drops hitting the roof and the faint crunching of leaves outside that came and went. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw footprints in the mud around the cabin. They weren't made by an animal. They were clearly human. I could see the treads of boots, and from the size and shape, it looked like they belonged to a man. The tracks came from the woods and circled around the back of the cabin before disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a while trying to think rationally. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe a hunter was passing through. It's not illegal to be out here, even if it is private land. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, the idea that someone had walked around the cabin in the middle of the night unsettled me. I kept my pocket knife with me that day. I didn't go hiking. I stayed close, occasionally glancing toward the treeline. Nothing happened that day or that night. I didn't hear any more sounds outside. I tried to shake it off. The next morning, I went to grab some firewood I had stacked under the overhang out back, and I noticed the wood was scattered. Some of the smaller logs had rolled down the slope behind the cabin. Someone had kicked them or moved them, maybe even tried to carry some away. I could see a few fresh scuff marks in the dirt that hadn't been there before. That was the first time I felt a real wave of anxiety. Someone had definitely been close to the cabin again. I checked inside and made sure everything was where I left it. Nothing was missing, but the fact that someone had come that close without making themselves known bothered me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel like I'd been scared off. I figured I'd stay one more night, maybe two, then head home early. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside felt sharper. I heard the wind pushing through the trees and branches creaking, but I kept thinking I was hearing something else, quieter, like footsteps or breathing just beyond the walls. I kept my knife close, and I barely closed my eyes. In the morning, I found more footprints near the porch, and this time I noticed something else. One of the windows, one I hadn't touched since arriving, was slightly open. It was a small window in the kitchen. It didn't open easily, and it made a sound when moved, which I definitely would have remembered. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how it could be open. There was no way the wind had done it. I checked the lockbox I had put outside with the spare keys and saw that it had been pried open and left empty. That's when I knew for sure someone was deliberately messing with me. I didn't feel like I was just being watched. I felt like someone was preparing for something. I packed my things quickly, loading them into my car. I didn't hear anything in the woods while I worked, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had the clear sense that someone was nearby, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to start the car, but nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I checked under the hood, and at first, everything looked fine. But then I noticed the battery cables had been pulled loose. Not just disconnected, yanked out with the connectors bent slightly. That wasn't something that would have happened by itself. Someone had done it deliberately. I reconnected the cables as best I could, my hands shaking. When I tried again, the engine started up. I didn't waste time. I reversed out of the dirt lot, kicked up gravel, and drove back down the winding path without stopping. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I drove until I hit the paved road again, then kept going until I reached a small town with a gas station and a diner. I sat in the parking lot for a while, just breathing. It wasn't until I had cell service again that I turned my phone back on. I had no new messages, nothing urgent, but it felt good just to be connected again. I told my brother everything later that night. We agreed not to tell my friend what had happened. He lived in another state and rarely came up to Vermont anyway, and I didn't want to scare him or make it seem like I couldn't handle a few nights alone. A few weeks later, my friend called to say he had gone up to check on the cabin. He said the place looked fine, except the lockbox was broken and there were boot prints all around the back porch. He asked if I had done that. I told him I might have dropped the box or something while I was there, trying not to make a big deal out of it. He said he'd install a camera next time he was up there. I don't think he ever did. I still think about that week sometimes. I don't know who was out there, what they wanted, or how long they had been watching. But I know I wasn't imagining it. Someone had come close, too close, and they hadn't wanted to be seen. They waited until I was asleep. They crept around the cabin. They touched the windows, opened the lockbox, scattered the wood pile, and sabotaged the car. They knew I was there. They watched me. They made sure I knew they were there without ever showing themselves. That's what gets to me the most. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I've gone hiking and camping in other places, but never alone, and never in a cabin that far out. I learned that even in places that feel quiet and peaceful, people can still be out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. Not every threat has to be loud or violent. Sometimes it just waits, quiet, patient, close. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 37 then, working a stressful job as a regional maintenance coordinator for a logistics company in eastern Pennsylvania. I lived alone, barely saw my family, didn't have a lot of close friends anymore, and I could feel my mind slipping into that fog that comes before burnout. So I put in for a week off, packed up my old Tacoma with food, firewood, and the basics, and drove out to a cabin I had found on a listing site. It was located near the Allegheny National Forest, about 3 hours northwest from where I lived. I wanted quiet. I wanted no phone signal. I wanted to be away from people. The cabin was advertised as off-grid, which I liked. I didn't want luxury. I wanted silence, trees, and no interruptions. When I got there, I was surprised by how remote it really was. The gravel road that took me there wound off the main road for over 2 miles, dipping through the woods and climbing small hills. No signs, no fences, just raw forest. The cabin was a single-level structure made of aging pine logs, perched on a small clearing about 30 yards wide, surrounded on all sides by tall trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. It had no electricity, just a wood stove, a propane lamp mounted to the wall, and a small generator out back that powered the water pump for the sink and the small toilet inside. I arrived just before sunset. The last bit of orange light slanted through the trees as I unpacked the cooler, the sleeping bag, the portable battery for my flashlight, and a box of books I had been meaning to read. I brought a notebook too. I thought I might write something, maybe just journal, maybe just clear my head. The air was cold, already dropping into the 40s even though it was only early October, and there was a smell of dry leaves and wet bark all around. I lit the propane lamp and started a small fire in the wood stove. It felt good in there, the heat soaking slowly into the floorboards, the air getting thick with the scent of pine smoke. The first night was peaceful. I slept early, maybe around 9. No sounds but the occasional pop of the stove or a soft creak from the old wood frame. I woke once, maybe at 2 or 3 in the morning, and stepped out to take a leak. The night was pitch black. I couldn't even see the tree line from the porch. My flashlight barely touched the dark. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be so cut off. Not scary, just heavy, like the woods had swallowed everything. The next day, I walked some of the surrounding trails. There were no marked paths, but the undergrowth wasn't too thick. I followed deer tracks, looked at trees, kicked through leaf piles, and just let my mind drift. I didn't see a single person or hear a single sound besides birds and wind. Around noon, I ate by the fire pit outside the cabin, then spent the afternoon reading a book I found at a garage sale a year earlier. I hadn't realized how much I needed that stillness until I felt it. No pressure to check email. No one expecting anything from me. That night, I noticed something odd. I was inside, cooking a can of chili on the stove. I had just taken off my boots and was sitting by the fire, eating, when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It was soft, actually, like something brushing lightly against the porch steps. I paused, held my breath for a moment, and listened. Nothing. Total silence again. I figured it was an animal. Raccoons, maybe, or deer. The woods were full of them. I walked to the door, opened it slowly, and looked out. Nothing but shadows and trees. My flashlight beam scanned the clearing. No eyes, no movement, no sound. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to finish my food. I didn't sleep as well that night, not because I was scared, but because I kept half-waking from small sounds. Not loud bangs, not howls, just light scratches, faint crunches of dry leaves, occasional dull thuds that sounded too spaced out to be an animal moving quickly. Every time I sat up and listened, the sound stopped. By morning, I was tired. I made coffee over the stove, sat out on the porch, and watched the sunlight spill in through the trees. The uneasiness I felt overnight started to wear off. I reminded myself it was probably a raccoon or even a porcupine or possum. They move strangely, make weird noises, nothing to worry about. But later that morning, I noticed something that stuck with me. I had walked about half a mile from the cabin to look at a section of pine forest with thicker tree coverage. I was kneeling down to inspect some old boot prints in the dirt. They didn't look fresh, but they were shaped like hiking boots. I thought maybe the cabin owner came out here often. As I turned to head back, I saw a plastic water bottle resting at the base of a tree. It was dented, dirty, but still had some water in it. Not mine. I hadn't brought disposable bottles. I carried a canteen. Then, as I walked back along the same rough path, I saw something else. A broken branch on a tree about 7 feet up, snapped clean. Below it, a piece of red fabric caught on the bark. Faded, torn, like from a jacket or flannel shirt. No blood or anything, but it looked like it had been there for a few weeks. That stopped me in my tracks. I kept glancing over my shoulder the rest of the way back. That night, it was colder. I had started stacking wood beside the stove early. I kept the propane lamp on longer than usual, letting the shadows stay off the walls. I also kept the flashlight on my lap while I sat in the chair watching the fire. I didn't want to admit that I was nervous, but I felt like I was being stupid by not being more cautious. I had no cell signal.
No neighbors.
And I had seen clear signs someone else had been out there recently. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was the sound of someone or something moving across the porch. Heavy, slow footsteps, not like a raccoon, not a deer, sounded like boots. I froze in the sleeping bag. My flashlight was under the pillow. I grabbed it slowly and turned it on. The footsteps stopped. I waited a full 5 minutes before unzipping the sleeping bag and standing. The fire had gone out. The lamp was off. I moved toward the door and listened. Nothing, just the wind brushing the side of the cabin. Then I looked through the small square window beside the door. First, I saw nothing, but then I noticed something very subtle. There were boot prints on the porch, clear in the thin layer of dust and leaves. I hadn't made them. I hadn't stepped outside since late afternoon. My boots were inside, still drying from my earlier walk. The prints led toward the side of the cabin, then disappeared off the porch. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I walked slowly, scanning every tree, every branch. I found no one, no more footprints. But about 30 feet into the woods, I found something that shook me worse than the prints. A fire ring, recently used, still smelled like ash and smoke. There were 3 beer cans crushed in a pile, a plastic wrapper from some kind of snack, and a partially buried metal fork. It wasn't far from the cabin. Someone had been camping there, watching. I walked straight back and started packing. I didn't care if I still had 3 days left. I didn't feel safe. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just someone. Some person living out there or hiding or squatting. That was worse. People are worse. I tossed everything back into the truck, checked under the cabin, checked the generator shed, locked the cabin behind me, and got in. The road out felt longer than it had coming in. Every tree felt like it was hiding someone. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out behind me. I never reported it to anyone. I never told the owner. I left a review that just said, "Cabin was peaceful but too remote for my comfort." That was it. I didn't want to be dramatic or bring trouble. I just wanted to forget it. But weeks later, I was watching the news, and I saw something that made my stomach sink. A man had been arrested in the Allegheny National Forest area. He had been wanted for theft and suspected of several disappearances. They caught him living in a makeshift campsite less than a mile from a cabin rental area. They showed photos of his camp. Same beer cans, same brand, same exact red flannel caught on a tree behind the site. I didn't say anything. I just turned off the TV and sat there for a long time. I think about that trip more often than I'd like to admit. I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Sometimes, I still wake up in the night, thinking I hear someone walking outside. But when I open my eyes, I'm back in my apartment, back where there are streetlights, sirens, voices behind the walls. I don't think I'll ever go that deep into the woods alone again. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided I needed to get away from everything for a while. I was 32 at the time, working a job I didn't love in Indianapolis, living alone in a small apartment just outside the city. Life had started to feel like one long blur of traffic, emails, and silent dinners. I wasn't depressed or anything, but I felt tired all the time, like I had been walking in circles for months without noticing it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel something different. So, I rented a small cabin up in Michigan, in a remote area near the Manistee National Forest. The place had no internet, no phone reception, and barely any sign of other people. It was a simple wooden structure with a sloped green metal roof, a small front porch, and a single chimney sticking out of the top. Inside, it was just one big room with a wood stove, a small kitchenette, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There was a separate bathroom with a composting toilet and a small shower, but that was it. I brought a few books, some basic groceries, a camping knife, and enough bottled water to last the week. The cabin came with firewood and propane, so I figured I'd be fine. The first day was quiet. I arrived just after lunch, parked the car behind the cabin where the dirt road ended, and carried my stuff inside. The forest was already deep into fall colors. Yellows, reds, and browns all around me, and the air smelled like dry leaves and cold soil. It was peaceful, and I liked that. I spent the afternoon walking down a trail behind the cabin, just exploring. I didn't go far. Maybe half a mile down, I found a small stream and some animal tracks, probably deer, and then turned back. That night, I made a fire, ate a can of chili, and went to bed early. I didn't even check my watch. The second day, I woke up before the sun rose. The cabin was cold, so I lit a fire and wrapped myself in a blanket while I made oatmeal on the gas burner. Outside, everything was still. No cars, no planes, no human sounds at all. Just the wind in the trees and a few birds. It was strange how fast I had adjusted to the silence. I spent most of the day reading, then chopped a bit of wood with the hatchet I found near the firewood pile. Around 5 in the evening, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 yards from the porch, there was a small patch of earth that looked like it had been disturbed. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a slightly raised area of dirt, darker than the ground around it. I figured maybe an animal had dug something up, or maybe the ground was softer there. I didn't think much of it. That night, as I sat on the porch with a mug of hot water in my hands, I noticed the forest was quieter than it had been the night before. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence, like the woods had shut themselves off. I stayed out for another 10 minutes before going inside and locking the door, even though I hadn't bothered the night before. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a thud. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like something hitting the wall outside. I sat up in bed and waited, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, just that single thud and then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there under the covers, wide awake, waiting for another sound. None came. Eventually, after about an hour, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. Nothing was out of place. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls. On the backside, near the base of the wall under the bedroom window, there was a small dent in the wood, like something heavy had struck it. Not enough to do real damage, but enough to mark it. It wasn't there when I arrived, I was sure of that. I stood there staring at it for a while, then walked over to the tree line and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of animals. Just silence and leaves. Later that day, I took the same trail I had walked on the first day. I figured some movement would help me shake the weird feeling I had. I passed the same stream, followed the same path, but this time I kept going a little farther. Maybe another half-mile in, I found something odd. There was a small clearing just off the trail, and in the middle of it, someone had built a fire pit. Not a casual one, either. It was surrounded by stones in a neat circle, with old ashes in the middle and pieces of charred wood. I hadn't seen any smoke, and the ashes were cold, but the pit didn't look abandoned. The wood looked too fresh. I looked around for any sign of people, maybe a tent, a trail camera, a tarp, anything, but the clearing was empty. I stayed there for a few minutes, then headed back to the cabin. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. Something about that fire pit didn't sit right with me. That night, I locked the door again and made sure all the windows were shut tight. I kept the hatchet near the bed and tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. I stayed up late reading, trying to distract myself, but around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was softer, like someone walking on dry leaves. I got out of bed and turned off the lantern. I stood there in the dark, listening. The sound came from the back of the cabin again. Slow steps, like someone trying not to be heard. Then it stopped. I waited maybe 5 minutes, then moved quietly to the window and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just the trees and the faint outline of the trail in the moonlight. Still, I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed up the whole night, sitting in the chair by the stove with the hatchet in my hand. When the sun finally came up, I went outside right away. I walked around the cabin again and found more marks near the back. Footprints this time. Not boot prints, bare feet. I'm not an expert, but they looked like adult feet, wide and flat, with deep impressions in the soft ground. The steps came out of the woods, circled the cabin, and then went back into the trees. I followed them a short way, maybe 30 feet, before they disappeared into the leaves and underbrush. That day, I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but I didn't leave. I wanted to, badly, but something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or just stubbornness. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave first thing in the morning. No more walks, no more exploring. Just one more night. I kept the hatchet even closer that evening, and I blocked the front door with a chair. I kept a flashlight in my hand, and I turned off all the lights inside. I sat there in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came around the front, slow and steady. I moved to the front window and peeked through a crack in the curtain. I didn't see anything at first, just the porch and the trees beyond. Then I noticed a shape move between two trees, low and slow. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, crouched low, moving sideways like they were trying to stay hidden. I ducked down, heart racing. Whoever it was, they didn't come closer. After about 10 minutes, the sound stopped again. I stayed on the floor for an hour before I dared to move. I didn't sleep at all that night. At sunrise, I got in the car and drove out fast. The dirt road was narrow and rough, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost 40 miles south. I went inside, used the bathroom, and stood in front of the coffee machine shaking so hard I could barely hold a cup. I didn't talk to anyone, I just got in the car and kept driving until I made it back to Indianapolis. Later that week, I called the rental company and told them something strange had happened at the cabin. I didn't go into detail. They just said they'd look into it. I never heard back. A few months later, I tried to find the listing online again, but it was gone. Maybe they took it down, maybe someone else bought it. I didn't care. I never went back. I still think about that place sometimes. About the tracks, the fire pit, the sound of footsteps in the leaves. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some local living off-grid, or someone messing with me for fun. But there was something about the way they moved, how careful they were, how quiet they stayed. Felt like it wasn't random. Felt like they had done it before. But the part that really gets to me, the part one still remember in the middle of the night, is what I found weeks later when I finally unpacked the last of my stuff. In the bottom of my duffel bag, buried under a sweatshirt, was a small piece of twine. Not mine. I don't carry twine. It was rough, homemade, and tied into a loop. I don't know how it got there. I don't know when. Maybe it meant nothing. But I haven't gone back to the woods since. And I don't think I ever will. I was 31 when I decided to rent a cabin up north by myself for a week. It was October 2022. I just finished a rough year at work. Long hours, barely any breaks, and a promotion that came with more stress than pay. I lived in Des Moines, and the cabin was in northern Minnesota, near a place called Toft, just off a winding gravel road that curved into Superior National Forest. I'd found the place on a rental site, not fancy, just old pine logs, a pitched roof, and a porch that faced the trees. There was no cell signal up there, and that was the point. I wanted to disconnect, sleep in, go for hikes, maybe read something that wasn't work-related. I packed a few books, canned food, instant coffee, some tools just in case, and drove up on a chilly Sunday morning. It was colder than I expected. The leaves were already past peak color, and most of them were on the ground. It rained off and on during the drive, but when I got to the cabin around 5 p.m., it was clear. The place looked just like the photos, small, quiet, nestled in thick trees that blocked most of the fading daylight. There was a gravel spot to park and a little path leading to the front door. Inside, it smelled faintly like old wood and dust. The cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a kitchenette, a little cast iron stove for heat, and a separate bathroom with a toilet and a small shower. There were windows on 3 sides, though most were small and high up. A few had blinds, some didn't. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. It was so quiet I couldn't sleep at first. No cars, no humming appliances, no city noise. Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin's frame. I woke up a few times to drink water or use the bathroom, but eventually fell into a deeper sleep. When I woke up the next morning, it was around 9. The sun was filtering through the trees, and I could hear the wind again. I had breakfast, did some stretching, and then went for a walk along the old forest road. There was no one else around. I didn't see any cabins nearby, no signs of recent vehicle tracks. I walked for about an hour, passed a few overgrown paths leading into the woods, and turned around. Felt good being disconnected. I made a late lunch and spent the afternoon reading outside in a camp chair I'd brought. That night, it got colder. I lit the wood stove and kept it going as I made soup and boiled some tea water. I went to bed early again. That's when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a loud snap outside. It sounded like a branch breaking. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer stepping on something. Then I heard the crunch of gravel near the driveway. My body froze. It wasn't fast or heavy, but it wasn't quiet either. Like someone walking slowly, maybe in boots. I got up as quietly as I could and looked out the window, pulling the blind to the side just enough to peek through. I couldn't see anything at first. The moon was bright enough to light the clearing in front of the cabin, and nothing moved out there. I stood there for a long time, listening. Eventually, I told myself it had to be an animal and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I checked outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, just leaves and gravel. I walked down the road again, this time farther, to clear my head. But the whole time, I had the feeling I was being watched. Every time the trees rustled, I'd stop and turn. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no wind strong enough to explain the movement. I kept walking, trying not to let my mind wander too far into paranoia. That evening, I brought more wood inside, made dinner, and tried to relax. I locked the door, checked the windows, and kept the stove going. Around 10, I killed the lights and got into bed. I lay there for a long time listening. It was quieter than the first 2 nights. No wind, no branches moving, no distant owl calls, just silence. And then, around 3 a.m., the crunching came back. This time, it was closer, more deliberate, like someone circling the cabin. I sat up and listened hard, barely breathing. There were slow steps on the gravel, then on the dead leaves, then silence. A minute later, I heard what sounded like a soft tap against one of the walls, then nothing again. I wanted to believe it was a tree limb falling or some animal scratching, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like fingers. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, holding my breath for long stretches. I didn't dare look out the window this time. I just waited. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard the sound fade away. I stayed awake until daylight. That morning, I walked around the cabin again. Still nothing obvious. No tracks, no scuffs on the walls, no signs of animals digging or scratching. I told myself I was overthinking it, maybe dreaming it, but part of me knew better. I considered leaving early. It wasn't like I had to stay the whole week, but it also felt dumb to run from something that might not even be real. I told myself I'd give it one more night. If anything else happened, I'd leave the next morning. That afternoon, I kept busy. I chopped some firewood, went for a short hike with a small hatchet clipped to my belt, and made an early dinner. I pulled the blinds tight on every window that had them and pushed furniture in front of the 2 that didn't. Before dark, I locked the door and brought my hatchet inside. I didn't light the stove that night. I didn't want to cast flickering shadows on the windows. I just wore layers and stayed in bed with the covers up, hatchet within reach. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, eyes open, ears straining. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was more than just footsteps. There was a dragging sound, like something being pulled through the leaves. Then a soft thud, like something being set down on the porch. I held the hatchet tight and waited. Then came the slow creak of the porch boards. 1, 2, 3 steps. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the faintest scraping sound, like a fingernail or a piece of metal against the doorframe. Then nothing. I stayed frozen until the sky began to lighten. The sounds never came back. At first light, I got up, packed my gear, and shoved everything into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just drove, not stopping until I hit Duluth. Back home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't prove anything had happened. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear a vehicle. No doors were tampered with. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me. A few weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone. I searched the name of the owner from my booking receipt, but nothing came up. It was like the place had vanished. I checked online forums, rental reviews, even satellite maps of the area. Nothing showed the cabin I stayed in. I wasn't even sure what road I'd taken to get there anymore. Most of the forest roads didn't have names, and GPS hadn't worked. I still have the photos I took. Just a few of the trees and the stove and one blurry shot of the porch. They don't prove much. I showed a couple of friends, but I never told them the full story. They'd think I imagined it, and maybe part of me wanted to believe that too. But I didn't imagine the sound of those steps, or the dragging, or the scrape on the doorframe. I know what I heard. I know I wasn't dreaming. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stayed in another cabin, even with friends. I don't plan to. Some things aren't worth the risk. Out there in the woods, miles from the nearest help, you're just another part of the silence. And sometimes the silence is listening. It was October of 2018 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 36 years old then, working a job that drained every bit of energy I had during the week. The city had become loud in ways I hadn't noticed before. People were always rushing, and the sound of traffic and construction had started to feel like nails on a chalkboard. I needed silence. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. So, when I found this small listing online for a secluded cabin near a place called Alder Creek, it felt like a perfect idea. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no internet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took me nearly 6 hours. The last part of it was nothing but dirt road that twisted through thick trees. Leaves had turned deep red and orange, and they fell constantly onto the road like confetti. I kept the windows up because the cold air cut sharp even during the day. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. Sunlight pushing through branches, no other cars in sight, not even a mailbox. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I imagined, but clean and sturdy, with siding, tin roof, a stone chimney. There was a little shed about 20 feet off to the side, half hidden behind trees, and a narrow path that led down toward the sound of running water. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. No power, but there were a few lanterns hanging on hooks, a pile of chopped wood, and a hand pump for water at the sink. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the weekend. Canned food, a camp stove, flashlight, spare batteries, matches, and a first aid kit. I wasn't trying to rough it, but I wanted quiet, and this place had it. After unpacking and settling in, I lit a lantern, cracked open a beer, and just sat on the steps outside, listening to nothing but trees rustling and the occasional snap of twigs from animals I couldn't see. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, bundled in layers with the fire keeping the room just warm enough. In the morning, I made instant coffee and walked around the property. The path led to a small creek with cold, clear water. I sat on a rock and watched it move around fallen branches. There was no sign of other people anywhere, not even trash or boot prints. It was one of the few times in my adult life I felt truly alone in a good way. Later that day, I decided to check out the shed. It had an old padlock, but the key had been left on a hook inside the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual tools: an axe, handsaw, some rusty garden tools, a gas can, and what looked like a stack of old wooden crates pushed against the back wall. Nothing unusual. The air smelled like old wood and gasoline. I didn't spend long in there. That evening, I made a small fire outside and sat under the stars. There were so many stars. Without city lights, they looked like they were doubled in number. I ate a cold can of beans and sat quietly, watching the fire until it burned down. I felt content. That was probably the last moment I truly felt that way. It started with sounds, very faint at first. On the second night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Nothing unusual in the woods, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. Not just a snap, but a deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I sat up, turned off the lantern, and listened. For a while, it was completely quiet. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too heavy, too slow for an animal. I waited maybe 20 minutes, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then it stopped. Whatever it was, I didn't hear it again that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Animals live in the woods. That's their home, not mine. I spent the day chopping some wood, exploring a bit further up the creek, and reading a book I'd brought. But I kept looking over my shoulder more than before. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the shed, closed the latch on the cabin door, and even wedged a chair under the knob. I lay in bed fully clothed with my flashlight on the pillow beside me. And again, I heard it, this time closer. Definitely footsteps, slow and spaced out, circling the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. They would stop for a long time, then start again like whoever or whatever it was standing still, waiting. At one point, They got so close I could hear leaves being pushed aside, almost like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously, holding the axe I'd taken from the shed. There were faint marks in the ground, flattened patches of leaves, a few scuffed spots in the dirt, but nothing clear enough to say for sure what it was. Could have been my own tracks. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then out toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched had burrowed deep into my skin. I considered leaving that day. I had enough gas in the car, and my nerves were fried. But some dumb, stubborn part of me didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was an animal and I was letting my imagination run wild. So I stayed, but I didn't relax. I kept the axe with me, stayed close to the cabin, and hardly touched the food I'd brought. Everything felt wrong. That night, I barely kept the fire going. I was too focused on the woods, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees over and over. I thought maybe I could scare off whatever it was just by showing I was alert. But just after midnight, something happened that pushed everything too far. There was a sound behind the shed, a solid thump, not a twig or a footstep. Something hit the side of it. I ran toward it without thinking, shining the light on the wall. Nothing. Then I swung the beam around and caught a figure in the corner of the light. Just a flash of a person, half hidden behind the trees. It was so quick, I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. But the shape was clear, upright, human-sized, moving fast. I yelled, even though I knew it was pointless. There was no answer, and they were gone. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I locked the door. Sure, but I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in my hands, flashlight off. I didn't want to give away my position. Every sound from the woods sounded like footsteps now. Every breeze that moved the trees made my muscles tense. It was a long, endless night, and when the sun finally came up, I was shaking from exhaustion and cold. I decided to leave immediately. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, dumped what I didn't need in the trash barrel behind the cabin, and jumped in the car. But as I drove back down the dirt road, something made me stop. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I spotted something odd on the side of the road. A piece of red fabric, torn and tangled in a branch. I got out, heart pounding, and found that it was part of a flannel shirt, just hanging there, like someone brushed past it in a hurry. Not mine. I looked around, but there was no one. I got back in the car and didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. Back in the city, everything felt loud again, but now it was a kind of comfort. I was surrounded by people, by noise, by light. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, the footsteps, the figure, the shirt. I hadn't imagined all of it. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe just messing with me, but it was real. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office once I got home. I didn't expect them to find anything, and I doubt they even went up there. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take trips now and then, but never alone and never without cell service. I got rid of the axe too. I don't like the way it made me feel, sitting there with it in the dark, listening for someone who never came inside. What scares me most isn't what happened, though. It's what didn't. It's that whoever was out there never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. That was enough. That's what still keeps me up sometimes. Thinking about those woods, that shed, those footsteps, is how easily someone can become a part of your weekend without ever needing to say a word. I'd always wanted to get away from it all, to disconnect and find some peace in nature. That's how I ended up at a small, remote cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. It was early November, the kind of season where the air has a bite to it, but the ground hasn't yet frozen solid. The leaves on the trees had already turned into shades of amber and gold, and the skies were often overcast, heavy with the impending promise of snow. My name is Ben Richards, and I was 29 years old when I decided to take this solo trip. My life in the city had become a bit too much to handle. The noise, the constant rush, the traffic. It all had a way of wearing me down. I thought that spending a week alone in a cabin would clear my mind, give me time to think. The cabin was an old place, tucked away deep in a forest, far from any signs of civilization. The nearest town was about 30 miles away, and the road leading up to the cabin was a narrow, unpaved trail that barely looked wide enough to fit my car. I had been following the directions I'd received online, but after a while, I started to wonder if I had made a wrong turn. The trees around me were dense, the kind that looked like they had been there for centuries, twisting their branches high above. The silence was almost suffocating. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional screech of a crow in the distance. I had my windows down, trying to take in the fresh, earthy scent of the forest, but that only seemed to make the quiet more intense. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, one-story, with a weathered wooden exterior that had clearly seen better days. It looked like something out of an old postcard. There was no electricity, no running water, just a small, rustic shelter in the woods. Perfect place to get away from it all. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the cabin. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled musty. Dust and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. There was a single room with a fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen area to the right, and a rickety wooden table with mismatched chairs. A few items of old furniture were scattered around: a faded couch, a cracked coffee table, and a bed tucked away in the back corner. The walls were bare, except for a few framed photos of nature scenes, maybe placed there by the previous owners to make it feel homier. There was something eerie about the stillness of the place. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames providing the only warmth and light. The evening was fast approaching, and the chill of the forest outside began to creep in. I couldn't help but feel the isolation of the place. It was different from what I had imagined. More haunting, more empty. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though the sheets felt a little rough. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept wandering. I had been looking forward to the solitude, but now that I was here, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The wind outside howled through the trees, and every so often, I would hear the creak of the wooden walls settling. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a figure standing outside, but nothing was there. The silence of the cabin pressed in around me, and I felt a rising unease in my chest. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint tapping, like something scratching at the walls. It was coming from the back corner of the cabin, near the window. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. The noise continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay still, holding my breath. My mind raced with all sorts of wild thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or something smaller that had found its way inside the walls. But no, it sounded too deliberate, like something was moving around just outside my reach. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the floorboards. I crept over to the window and peered outside, but there was nothing there. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. But I saw nothing. I returned to bed, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in my chest. The rest of the night passed in fitful, uneasy sleep, with the occasional creak of the house and the distant howling of the wind. But nothing else disturbed me. The next morning, I woke up to a pale, gray light filtering in through the trees. I got dressed, made some coffee on the small stove, and sat down at the table to eat breakfast. The cabin was even colder than it had been the night before, and the silence was unnerving. It felt like the world outside was holding its breath. I spent the day walking around the area, trying to push the strange occurrences from my mind. The forest around the cabin was dense and beautiful. The leaves had mostly fallen by now, leaving the ground covered in a carpet of brown, crunching underfoot. I noticed a few animal tracks here and there. Deer, squirrels, maybe even a bear, but nothing that indicated any immediate danger. The woods were peaceful, if not a little too quiet. But as evening approached, the feeling of isolation grew heavier. The cabin was far from any road, and the thought of being so alone in the wilderness began to feel more and more unsettling. The idea that something or someone could be out there, just beyond the trees, watching me, it was hard to shake. That night, I decided to take some extra precautions. I locked the door, secured the windows, and piled extra firewood on the hearth. I had brought a small radio with me, hoping the noise would make the place feel a little less silent. But when I turned it on, all I could hear was static. It was the kind of eerie silence that made every small sound feel amplified. I lay in bed, my eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, but nothing was out of place. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I was woken by a loud banging sound. It was sharp and sudden, echoing through the cabin like a clap of thunder. My heart leaped in my chest, and I jumped out of bed, stumbling to the door. The noise had come from the back of the cabin again, the same place as the night before. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way over to the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the curtain and shined the beam of light out into the darkness. There was nothing there. The woods were still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, casting long shadows on the ground. I shone the light around, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was nothing unusual, just the same silent, eerie landscape. I walked back to the bed, my pulse still racing. My thoughts were spinning. What was going on? What was making that noise? Was it something natural, or was I just letting my imagination run wild? I tried to go back to sleep, but the banging continued. It came in waves, first a thud, then a series of lighter taps, as if someone was trying to knock on the door, or something was scraping against the side of the cabin. The sounds were maddening, and my nerves were starting to fray. In a burst of frustration and fear, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting against my skin as I made my way around the cabin, shining the flashlight along the walls, looking for anything that could explain the noise. My breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the pale light of the moon. But there was nothing, no sign of animals, no evidence of wind or rain that could be causing it. Just the same stillness that had been there when I first arrived. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a shadow moving between the trees. My heart stopped. It was just a glimpse, a flash of movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I had seen. Had someone been out there? Had I not been alone this whole time? I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breath, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the figure was gone now, swallowed by the darkness. The only sound was the wind through the trees. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller, more confining now, as though it were closing in around me. I sat by the fire, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. The noise stopped after that as suddenly as it had started. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, with me lying in bed, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The night passed without any further disturbance. The next morning, I packed my things and left as early as I could. The feeling of dread still hung over me, the weight of the woods pressing on my chest. I didn't know what had happened, but I didn't want to stay to find out. The cabin had become something else, something strange and unsettling, and I had no intention of coming back. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind me, and didn't look back. Maybe it was just the isolation, the quiet, or the fact that I had been in a strange place for too long. But what I was 32 the summer I decided to take a week off from work and stay in a cabin outside Missoula, Montana. It was 2022, and I was burnt out from a string of back-to-back projects and needed to be somewhere without phone service or noise. I found a listing on a website that offered quiet, secluded places. The description said it was an off-grid cabin, 3 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by forest. The photos showed a basic wooden structure, small porch, propane stove, wood-burning heater, a table and a bed. No Wi-Fi, no plumbing. It was exactly what I wanted. I drove up in a rented Jeep on a Sunday morning. The directions were printed since I wasn't expecting signal once I got close. After turning off the highway, I followed a gravel road for nearly 20 minutes, then onto a rougher trail that twisted through pine trees and climbed in elevation. I had to go slow because of the deep ruts and rocks. It was past noon when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, sitting in a small clearing about 50 yards wide. The roof was steep and covered in dark metal sheets. A thin chimney stuck out of the top. There was a stack of wood against the side wall and a blue barrel by the porch for collecting rainwater. It was quiet, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own breathing. The air smelled like pine and warm dirt. There were flies buzzing around the trees, but it wasn't too bad. I got out and stretched, then opened up the cabin. It was unlocked, just like the owner had said it would be. The inside was smaller than it looked in pictures, but clean. A small bed against one wall, a table and chair in the center, a stove in the corner, and some basic shelves with canned goods and matches. A cooler sat beside the door. No free. No lights except for a couple of battery-powered lanterns. I unpacked slowly, letting myself settle in. I brought enough food to last a week, mostly dry stuff and some fresh vegetables. There was a small outhouse maybe 50 feet into the trees, downhill from the cabin. The path to it was overgrown but still visible. That first night, I stayed up late on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. I had a fire going in the small fire pit a few steps from the cabin. I remember how quiet it was. I could hear the tiniest sounds, the wind shifting through leaves, a squirrel running across the roof, branches creaking somewhere out of sight. I fell asleep with the window cracked, the cool night air slowly drifting in. The first few days were peaceful. I went on short hikes during the day, following animal trails through the forest. I found an old logging road that led to a dry creek bed. I took photos of mushrooms, twisted roots, and the light breaking through the trees. I read in the afternoons and wrote in my notebook at night. By the third day, I stopped checking the time. My mind finally slowed down. It was on the fourth morning that I noticed something small and strange. When I went out to the rain barrel to wash my hands, I saw fresh scuff marks in the dirt around the porch. At first, I thought it was from me, but the shape looked different. The prints were longer and narrower than my boots, and there were two of them. They went toward the trees near the outhouse and disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't think too much about it. Maybe it was a hunter or a local who wandered too close. That afternoon, I hiked west, trying to reach a rocky outcrop I had seen from the clearing. It took longer than expected, and I ended up turning back earlier than I wanted. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I was tired and didn't notice anything off at first. I cooked, wrote a bit, and went to sleep with the window still open a crack. The next morning, when I opened the door to get some water, I saw more prints in the dirt. A single line of them from the edge of the woods to the porch, then circling around the cabin. They were definitely not mine. They were spaced farther apart than a normal walk. No tire tracks, just those same long, narrow boot marks. I felt a chill in my chest, but I told myself again that it could be someone from town or another hiker who got curious. It was public land, after all. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept listening for footsteps or branches snapping. I had the lantern beside the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I finally dozed off. I woke up later to the sound of something tapping on the wall. Not loud, just a slow, steady tap. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. I sat up and waited. The sound stopped. Then it started again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin, like someone was moving around. I didn't turn on the light. I just stayed still and listened. I couldn't see anything from the window. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my ears tuned to every creak and sound in the woods. When morning came, I checked outside. More prints. This time, they went right up to the window. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. I saw the spot where the leaves were flattened near the glass. My stomach turned. I kept scanning the trees, but there was nothing. I considered leaving early, but something in me didn't want to panic. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a kid messing around. Still, I decided to stay inside more that day and kept the hatchet beside me. That night, I barred the door using a piece of firewood wedged under the handle. I shut the windows completely. I didn't light the fire. I wanted it to look like I wasn't there. I laid in the dark, holding the hatchet, watching the window. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, slow and careful. They came from the direction of the outhouse, stopped for a long time, then circled to the back. I didn't move. I held my breath. Something brushed against the wall again, lightly. Then I heard the faint sound of metal, a tool maybe scraping wood. The noise stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I stayed still for another hour before falling asleep from exhaustion. When the sun came up, I got up and checked the cabin again. The back corner had a fresh scrape in the wood near the bottom, deep, as if something sharp had been dragged across it. I packed my gear in 15 minutes. I was done. I didn't see anyone on my way back to the Jeep. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I heard someone breathing behind a tree, but it could have been the wind. I got into the Jeep and started the engine without even checking my map. I followed the trail back to the gravel road and drove until I had cell service. When I stopped at a diner outside town, I sat there for 20 minutes before going inside. My hands were still shaking a little. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone except my brother when I got home. He laughed, said I'd scared myself in the woods. But I know what I heard. I know someone was out there. Someone who never said a word, never knocked, never left a note. Just walked through the forest, night after night, getting closer and closer. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I canceled another cabin trip I had booked later that year. Even now, years later, I think about that tapping, about the footprints, about how someone could live out there, just beyond the edge of silence, watching. What still bothers me most is the realization that they never tried to get in. Not really. They could have. The door was thin, the window easy to break, but they didn't. They just wanted to let me know they were there. Every night, closer. The scariest part wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. I was 37 when I decided to take a break from everything. The year was 2019, and I had just gone through a messy divorce that drained me emotionally and financially. I lived in a small town near Omaha, Nebraska, and worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. I didn't have kids, and I wasn't close with my family, so when things fell apart, it felt like there was no one left around me. I needed space. Time away from people, screens, traffic, expectations, all of it. I didn't want to find myself or go on some emotional journey. I just wanted to be alone. A friend of a friend had a small hunting cabin about 4 hours northwest, near the edge of the Niobrara Valley. It was deep in the woods, up a long gravel road with no neighbors nearby. It had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and ran on solar and propane. He said I could use it for free if I just cleaned up after myself. I didn't hesitate. I packed up my truck, bought some groceries, brought along a few books and notebooks, and headed out. The drive was long, flat, and mostly uneventful. I stopped in a small town for gas and to grab a few last-minute things, then turned off the highway onto a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The sun was low by the time I reached the cabin. It was a simple, one-story structure with a tin roof and dark wood siding. There was a small porch out front, and the windows were dusty but intact. A pile of chopped firewood sat near the door, and there was a propane tank behind the building. Inside, it was basic. One main room with a twin bed, a wood stove, a table and chair, and a small kitchenette. There was a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed sink. The windows had no curtains. It wasn't cozy, but it was what I wanted, solitude. That first night, I didn't do much. I made a can of soup on the little propane burner, read a few chapters of a book, and went to bed early. I left the windows open because it was still warm outside, and the sounds of the woods were loud. Bugs, owls, and distant rustling. Took me a while to fall asleep. The mattress was thin, and every creak of the wooden walls seemed amplified in the silence. But I was tired from the drive and eventually drifted off. The next few days were calm. I got up early, made coffee, sat outside on the porch, and watched the light change through the trees. I went on long walks, sometimes just following deer trails into the forest until I got tired. I wrote a few pages in a notebook each day, nothing deep, mostly just observations and random thoughts. I started to relax. My shoulders didn't feel as tight. My breathing slowed. I didn't think about work or my ex or anything beyond what I was going to eat or whether it might rain. But around the fourth day, things started to feel a little off. It began with small things. One morning, I found a set of footprints in the dirt near the woodpile. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size didn't match. These were longer and narrower, and I hadn't been out that early. They pointed toward the back of the cabin but didn't circle around. I stood there for a long time just looking at them. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone just passing through. But there were no other cabins nearby, and it was private land. Later that day, I walked around the cabin and checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed touched. Still, I moved the woodpile a little closer to the porch, just so I could see if it was disturbed again. That night, I kept the windows closed and latched. I didn't sleep as well. The next morning, the footprints were gone, washed away by dew or wind, but the feeling stayed with me. I tried to shake it off. I made a longer hike that day, down a small slope where a creek ran through a narrow valley. The water was low and clear. I sat on a rock and ate an apple and listened to the water for what felt like an hour. It helped. I felt a little more grounded again. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the unease returned quickly. That evening, I noticed that the axe I kept by the woodpile was missing. It had been leaning against the cabin wall. I searched around, thinking maybe it had fallen over or rolled down the slight incline behind the porch, but it was just gone. I hadn't moved it, and there was no wind strong enough to knock it away. I walked a full circle around the cabin with a flashlight, but I didn't see any signs of anyone. Still, I locked the door tight that night and put a chair against it. I didn't have a gun, just a small knife I used for cooking and a rusty hammer I found in a drawer. I kept both next to the bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, faint crunches in the underbrush. Could have been animals. Probably was. But every little sound seemed deliberate. I stayed still in the dark and stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each noise. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. Not a knock, more like a scrape. Then nothing. The next morning, I went outside as soon as it was light. The axe was back, leaning against the cabin wall exactly where I had left it originally. I froze when I saw it. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there. Someone had taken it and someone had brought it back. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was someone. I didn't want to panic. I stood there staring at the axe for a long time before picking it up and taking it inside. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. Maybe it was just a messed up prank. Maybe someone else knew about the cabin and thought it would be funny to mess with me. I didn't want to look paranoid or weak, so I stayed. But I changed my habits. I started keeping the axe inside. I kept all the windows locked. I moved the small table in front of the door at night. I stopped walking far from the cabin. I began to notice small changes, nothing huge, just tiny things. A rock placed on the porch that hadn't been there before. A small bundle of twigs tied with a bit of twine near the steps. The smell of wood smoke in the air even though I hadn't lit the stove. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up at around 3 a.m. to a faint sound. Something moving just outside the wall near my head. I held my breath and listened. It was a slow, steady sound. Footsteps in the leaves, circling the cabin. They moved carefully, not rushed. I waited in the dark, gripping the axe with both hands. The footsteps stopped at the front of the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I found something new. A small, half-burned candle was sitting on the porch railing. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any candles. It looked like the kind used for emergencies, white, stubby, cheap. Someone had left it there, placed deliberately. I picked it up with a towel, not wanting to touch it directly, and threw it into the woods as far as I could. That afternoon, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear wasn't just in my head. Someone was out there, and they weren't just passing through. They were watching me. They had been coming back, each night, getting closer, leaving things. Felt like a game, and I didn't want to know what came next. I packed quickly. I threw everything into my truck, didn't bother cleaning up. I was just about to lock the door behind me when I noticed a new footprint near the porch, deeper than the others. It was fresh. I didn't wait. I got in the truck and drove, faster than I should have, bouncing over potholes and ruts. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't go back to Omaha. I stayed with a friend in Kansas City for a few weeks. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I needed time. When I finally returned home, I sold most of my things, moved to a different part of the city, and never contacted the guy who lent me the cabin. I don't even remember his name now. It's been years since that happened, and I still think about it. Not every day, but often enough. I still don't know who it was. A local squatter? Some hunter playing games? Someone else who thought the cabin was theirs? I don't know. I never filed a report. What would I say? No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. But someone was there, and they were trying to scare me. And it worked. I don't go camping anymore. I don't go out to the woods at all. I lock my doors every night, double-check my windows. I even installed cameras around my apartment. Not that I think it'll help much. I guess the scariest part wasn't that someone was out there. It's that they never needed to break in. They were always outside, just close enough to remind me that I was never really alone. And I'll never forget that feeling. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far enough away from anything to feel isolated, but close enough to civilization that I could get there without too much trouble. I had rented it out for the weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet. It was early October, and the crisp, cool air hinted at the coming of winter. The trees had just begun to change, and the woods were full of that earthy, damp smell that comes when the leaves are turning. I arrived at the cabin around midday, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The place looked exactly like I'd expected. Old, weather-beaten wood, moss creeping up the sides, and a rusted metal chimney. It wasn't fancy, but that was part of the appeal. It was simple, a place to escape. I grabbed my backpack from the car and walked up to the front door, a bit nervous but mostly excited. The inside was even more rustic than I thought. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a couple of worn-out couches that had seen better days, and a small kitchen tucked into the back. The floors creaked underfoot, the wood soft and groaning as I moved around. There was a small window above the kitchen sink that looked out into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, but there was something comforting about it. I made myself comfortable, unpacking my things and setting up in one of the small bedrooms. It had a big, wooden bed with an old quilt draped over it. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and dusty old trinkets. I wasn't sure when this place had last been updated, but it didn't matter. It was perfect. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the darkening woods. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. There was a quiet unease settling in my stomach, but I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the isolation getting to me. As the night went on, the air grew colder. I was bundled up in a jacket, but I could still feel the chill in my bones. I went inside to warm up, lighting the fireplace and curling up on one of the couches with a book. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. It sounded like it was going to storm, and I was glad to be inside, where it was safe and dry. Around midnight, I started to hear strange noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe branches scraping against the side of the cabin. But then the noises became more distinct. soft thuds like something or someone was walking around outside. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noise didn't stop. It came closer and closer until I could hear something or someone moving around just outside the window. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around me, but the sounds continued. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the thick forest stretching out as far as I could see. I felt foolish standing there, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. Everything seemed fine. I went back to the couch, trying to shake off the tension that had built up in my chest. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound now. But then, just as I was beginning to relax again, there was a loud bang at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I waited, listening for any further sound. Nothing came. I slowly stood up, moving cautiously toward the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, but I didn't open it. I could feel my breath coming faster, the air suddenly thick with fear. There was no one there. I took a step back, still staring at the door. The feeling of being watched washed over me again. Stronger now. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what could be going on. Could be someone playing a prank, but who would come all the way out here to mess with me? There were no other houses nearby, no neighbors for miles. It didn't make sense. The wind had died down now, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, had me wide awake, listening for any sign of movement. The next morning, I was exhausted. I made a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, my mind still reeling from the strange events of the night before. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, hoping the fresh air would help. As I stepped outside, the morning sun had already begun to warm the air, and the woods were bathed in a soft, golden light. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt hollow somehow. I wandered down a small trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I kept walking, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, rustling leaves, seemed to have disappeared. All I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath my feet. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The trail had become overgrown, as though it hadn't been used in years. The more I looked around, the more I realized that the woods here felt different. The trees were taller, the underbrush thicker. I had wandered off the main path without realizing it. I had no idea how far I had gone, and for the first time I started to feel uneasy about being so far from the cabin. I turned around to head back, but the trail I had been following seemed to have disappeared. The trees were denser now, the branches intertwined above me like a canopy. I couldn't see the cabin or any sign of the main trail. Panic began to set in. I started walking faster, but everything around me looked the same, just more trees and thick underbrush. My mind raced as I tried to remember which way I had come from, but nothing made sense. After what felt like hours, I stumbled across a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a rundown cabin. It wasn't the one I had rented, but it looked eerily similar. The wood was rotting, the windows boarded up. It had clearly been abandoned for years. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. I had to know if someone else had been here, if they were the ones who had been messing with me. I reached the door and pushed it open, the old hinges creaking in protest. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. There was a small wood stove in the corner, the rusted remains of what might have once been a chair, and a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around the room. But what caught my eye was the small table near the window. There were pieces of paper scattered across it, as though someone had been writing or drawing something before they left. I picked up one of the papers, the edges torn and yellowed with age. The writing was scribbled, hurried, almost frantic. It was hard to make out, but the words "leave now" were clear. My heart skipped a beat, felt like a warning. I dropped the paper and backed away from the table, my mind racing. I didn't belong here. I didn't know what had happened in this cabin, but something about it felt wrong. I turned and ran out of the cabin, the fear bubbling up inside me. I needed to get back to my own cabin. I needed to get out of the woods. I didn't stop running until I finally saw the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance. I didn't look back. When I got back to the cabin, I locked every door and window, double-checking them to make sure they were secure. I didn't feel safe anymore. Whatever had been out there, whoever had been out there, had been trying to send me a message. I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I spent the rest of the day indoors, too scared to leave. The sun began to set, and the cabin grew darker, colder. I kept thinking about that abandoned cabin, about the note. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But nothing else happened that night. The noises from outside stopped, and the silence that followed was almost peaceful. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even stay for breakfast. I just wanted to get out of the woods. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It sat there, still and silent, hidden deep in the forest. I didn't know what had happened or who or what had been out there, but I was glad to be leaving. I had come to the woods for peace and quiet, but I had found something else, something I couldn't explain, something I never wanted to experience again. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I trudged up the narrow dirt path. My boots crunched against the fallen needles, each step drawing me closer to the cabin I had rented for the weekend. It wasn't much, but that was exactly what I was looking for. A place to escape, to clear my head. It had been a long year, filled with work stress, personal chaos, and a lot of unanswered questions. A weekend in the woods, with nothing but the company of the trees, seemed like the perfect remedy. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, nestled between towering trees, its wooden exterior weathered from years of exposure. The roof sagged slightly, the paint peeling in places, giving the building a worn but charming look. There were no neighbors for miles, just miles and miles of forest stretching in every direction. It was exactly the kind of isolation I needed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, and I could hear the sound of my breathing echo in the empty space. It was a simple cabin. One room, a small kitchen tucked in the corner, a few mismatched chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a large window that looked out over the forest. The furniture was basic, but it would do. I could already imagine sitting by the fire, reading a book, maybe taking a nap after a long hike. The peace I was searching for was finally within reach. After unpacking my things and lighting a fire in the stove, I decided to take a walk around the area. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky had that amber glow that you only get in the hours before sunset. The forest around me seemed almost alive, the trees shifting gently in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones. I walked for hours, slowly making my way through the thick woods. I wasn't in any rush, just letting my feet carry me where they would. There was something calming about the forest, the way everything seemed so still, so undisturbed. The sounds of birds and insects filled the air. The rustling of leaves beneath my feet was the only sign that anything was moving. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred, like I was walking through a place that had been untouched for centuries. As the light began to fade, I turned back toward the cabin. The walk had been longer than I intended, and I didn't want to be caught out here when the darkness fully set in. The woods, while beautiful, had an eerie feel once the sun went down. The trees took on a more ominous shape in the fading light, their long shadows stretching out like dark fingers reaching across the ground. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and settled in for the night. The fire was still crackling in the stove, its warmth radiating through the small room. I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and some crackers, eating slowly as I listened to the occasional pop of the firewood. The cabin felt cozy, almost intimate, and I could feel the tension from the outside world beginning to melt away. But then, around midnight, something changed. At first, it was subtle, just a small sound, a slight shift in the air. I couldn't place it, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I sat still for a moment, listening. There it was again, a soft thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wooden floor, came from the far side of the cabin, near the window. My heart skipped a beat. The house was small, far too small for any kind of animal to get in without me noticing. I got up from my chair and walked quietly toward the window. The night outside was pitch black, but I could make out the silhouette of the trees swaying in the breeze. No movement, nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there for a moment, staring into the dark forest, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind moving something against the wall. It was an old cabin, after all. But deep down, something didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and decided to go to bed. I turned off the lights and crawled under the thick wool blankets, trying to ignore the knot of discomfort twisting in my stomach. The fire had burned low, and the only sound now was the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house shifted with the cold. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept wandering back to the noise I'd heard. The thud, the scraping sound. It felt like it had come from inside the cabin, not from the outside. Maybe it was just an animal, something small like a raccoon rummaging around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence of the cabin seemed too thick, like it was pressing in on me. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave up on sleep. I got out of bed and pulled on my boots. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I opened the door and stepped outside onto the porch. I stood there for a moment, staring into the inky blackness of the forest. Nothing moved. The air was still, and all I could hear was the sound of my breath in the quiet night. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the flashlight along the ground. There was nothing out of place, no signs of animals or people, but still that feeling lingered. It was like the forest was watching me, waiting. After another hour, I gave up my search and returned to the cabin. The tension in my chest was growing, but I couldn't put my finger on why. There was nothing to explain it. The cabin was isolated, the door was locked, and everything appeared normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I woke up to a bright, crisp morning. The sun was shining through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air was fresh, and the world seemed peaceful again. I decided to go for another hike to clear my head, hoping that the events of the previous night were just my imagination. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice things that I hadn't seen before. Small marks on the trees, like someone had carved into the bark. I followed them for a while, but they seemed to lead in circles, never getting any closer to anything. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, but I pushed the feeling aside. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Nothing more. I spent the rest of the day wandering the forest, trying to focus on the beauty around me. By evening, I was back at the cabin, and I tried to relax in front of the fire. But no matter how much I told myself to calm down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The cabin felt colder now, emptier. The silence was oppressive, and every little noise seemed amplified. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound again. The thud, the scraping. It was closer this time, right outside my window. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the dark forest. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. My mind was playing tricks on me, or so I thought. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another night. The next morning, I packed up my things, my hands shaking as I stuffed my clothes into my bag. I had no reason to feel so terrified, but I couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I locked up the cabin, grabbed my keys, and left, driving back down the dirt path toward the nearest town. When I finally reached a small cafe, I stopped to grab some coffee and calm down. I overheard a conversation between two locals, an older man and a woman. about the cabin I had stayed in. The man spoke of the place in hushed tones, saying that strange things had happened there over the years. People had come and gone, but none had stayed for long. They talked about the woods, how they had a way of messing with your mind. I didn't stay to hear more. Couldn't. It didn't matter anymore. I was safe and I had no intention of ever going back. As I drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest. It was beautiful, silent, but I knew I was never going back there. Some things are better left unexplored.